The telegram was only 11 words long. Circumstances have changed. Do not come. The arrangement is dissolved. No signature, no explanation, no apology. Clara Whitmore read it 3 times, standing on the platform of the Harlan Creek rail station, her trunk at her feet and her traveling case clutched in both hands like it was the only solid thing left in the world. Around her, the other passengers dispersed into the late afternoon dust. Cowboys with rolled cigarettes, a family with too many children and too little luggage, a fur trapper who smelled like something had died on him recently. Nobody looked at her. Nobody stopped. She read the telegram a 4th time. Then she folded it, tucked it into the inside pocket of her coat, picked up her trunk, and walked forward. Because there was nowhere else to go. She had left Cincinnati 2 weeks ago with $34, 1 good dress, 2 plain ones, a Bible. Her mother had pressed into her hands at the train station. "Take this, Clara, just take it." And a letter of introduction from a marriage broker named Aldous Finch, who had assured her that Mr. Gerald Pruitt of Harlan Creek, Montana Territory, was a man of stable character and reasonable prospect. Gerald Pruitt, as it turned out, had changed his mind sometime between March and May without bothering to send word until she was already on the train heading west. Clara had been engaged once before, at 22, to a banker's clerk in Columbus who'd broken it off when his family decided she wasn't sufficiently well connected. She was 26 now. She understood what people said about women her age who remained unmarried. She had heard it often enough from her aunt, from the women at the church socials, from the quiet, pitying looks strangers gave her when they thought she wasn't paying attention. She had come west because she was tired of being looked at that way. Now she stood in front of a general store on the main street of Harlan Creek with a trunk too heavy to carry far and $11 and change in her coin purse, and she tried to think clearly. The town was larger than she'd expected. Not large by any civilized standard, but substantial for the territory. A main street with a hardware store, a land office, a livery stable, 2 saloons, a post office, and what appeared to be a hotel with a sign that read, "Rooms, 75 cents per night." A territorial courthouse sat at the far end of the street, its flag hanging limp in the dead heat. Clara counted her money and did the arithmetic. $11. At 75 cents a night, that bought her roughly 2 weeks. After that, she had nothing. She needed work. She needed it immediately, and she needed to find it before her money ran out and before anyone in this town figured out that she had arrived to marry a man who didn't want her. That kind of information, in a town this size, would spread like a grass fire. She picked up her trunk. The first person she asked was the woman sweeping the porch of the general store. A broad-shouldered woman in her 50s with sun-darkened skin and an expression that suggested she'd heard every hard luck story there was and wasn't particularly moved by any of them. "Work," the woman said flatly. "What kind of work can you do?" "I can teach," Claire said. "I have schooling. I can read, write, do figures. I can sew. I can cook reasonably well." "Teaching?" The woman snorted. "We don't have a schoolhouse, never had one. Children around here learn what their fathers teach them, and what their fathers know is mostly how to rope a steer and stay out of debt." "Is there anyone who might need a tutor, a family, perhaps, with children who—" "You a married woman?" Clara hesitated a half-second too long. The woman's eyes sharpened. "Didn't think so. No family out here is going to take in an unmarried woman to live in their house. That's not how things are done. You'd be better off finding a husband." "I'll keep that in mind," Clara said. She moved on. The hotel was run by a man named Vic Staley, who had a damp handshake and the kind of eyes that moved over a woman in a way that made her want to cross her arms. He gave her a room on the 2nd floor with a window that faced the alley, told her the washroom was shared, and charged her the full 75 cents in advance without offering to help with her trunk. She dragged the trunk up the stairs herself. The room was small and smelled like dust and old pipe smoke. The mattress was thin. The window latch was broken. She wedged a chair under the door handle before she lay down, still in her traveling clothes, and stared at the ceiling until the light changed. She did not sleep. By morning, she had a plan, such as it was. She would go to every business in town and ask about work. She would be direct, and she would not explain her circumstances to anyone who didn't need to know them. She would find something. What she found instead was that word travels fast in a small town. She didn't know how it happened, Whether someone at the rail station had seen the telegram exchange, or whether Gerald Pruitt himself had talked, or whether Aldous Finch had been less discreet than she'd assumed. But by the time she walked into the second saloon on the main street, hoping to speak to someone about serving tables or washing dishes, the man behind the bar looked at her with an expression of such unpleasant recognition that she knew the information had already circulated. "You're the Pruitt bride," he said. It wasn't a question. "I'm looking for work," Claire said. "Pruitt's bride is looking for work," the man said, louder, to no one in particular. There were 4 men at the bar and 3 at tables, and they all looked up at once. She should have left. She understood that later. She should have turned around and walked out and not given any of them the satisfaction of seeing her react. But she was tired from not sleeping, and she was frightened in a way that made her jaw ache from holding it clenched, and she had nowhere else to go, so she stayed. "I'm not anyone's bride," she said. "I'm a woman looking for respectable employment. If you don't have any to offer, I'll be on my way." "Respectable?" one of the men at the bar repeated, and laughed in a way that wasn't funny. She turned to leave. The man nearest the door moved first. Not fast, not dramatically, just enough to block her path. He was maybe 40, with a thick beard going gray and the kind of build that came from physical labor and a high tolerance for hard living. He didn't touch her. He just stood there and smiled. "No reason to rush off," he said. "Buy you a drink?" "No, thank you." Wasn't really a question. She looked at him steadily. She had learned over years of being alone in situations men had created for her that the worst thing she could do was show fear. It didn't stop what was going to happen, but it sometimes slowed it down. "I'm going to leave now," she said quietly. "Please move." "Pete," someone said from across the room. "Leave her be." Nobody moved. The bartender polished his glass and looked elsewhere. Then the door opened. She felt the change in the room before she understood what caused it. The temperature didn't drop. It was the middle of summer. But something shifted, the way air shifts before a storm. The man called Pete took half a step backward without seeming to realize he'd done it. The man who'd come in was not particularly large. That was the first thing Clara registered, and it surprised her because the room had reacted to him the way rooms react to large men. He was average height, lean in the way that ranching work made people lean, not thin, but compact, with nothing wasted about him. He wore a plain work coat, trail dusty, and a hat he didn't take off when he came through the door. He had dark hair going gray at the temples and a face that looked like it had been weathered down to the essential parts. A jaw, cheekbones, eyes the color of river water in November. Behind him, holding his coat hem with small, silent hands, were 2 boys who might have been 8 or 9, identical in the way that twins are identical, dressed in matching canvas trousers and shirts, with their father's same dark coloring and their father's same unreadable expression. He looked at Pete. He didn't say anything for a moment. "Cole," Pete said. His voice was different now. "This doesn't concern you." "She asked you to move," the man, Cole, said. His voice was low and unhurried, the kind of voice that didn't need volume to carry. "You didn't." "I'm just being friendly." "No, you're not." Cole moved into the room, just enough to put himself between Clara and Pete without making a production of it. He didn't look at her. He was watching Pete and the bartender and the man nearest the back wall all at the same time, the way a man watches a room when he's been in enough bad situations to develop the habit. "Move, Pete." Pete looked at him for a long moment. Whatever calculation he was running came up short. He stepped aside. Cole moved toward the door and held it open. He looked at Clara then for the first time directly, and his expression held no warmth or coldness or anything she could name, just a kind of flat, practical acknowledgement, the way a man looks at a problem he's going to deal with because it needs dealing with, not because he particularly wants to. "You should leave," he said. She left. He was standing on the boardwalk when she came out, his 2 sons arranged beside him like bookends, both of them watching her with the same careful, measuring eyes their father had. "Thank you," Clara said. She meant it, but the word felt inadequate for what had just happened. "Where are you staying?" he asked. "The hotel." He looked at the hotel, then back at her. "How long?" "Until I find work." She straightened her spine. "I'm a teacher. I have proper qualifications. I'm looking for a position tutoring children, or any respectable work that becomes available. Cole said nothing for a moment. He was looking at his sons now. Or rather, he was looking at them the way people look at things they carry but can't put down. One of the boys, the one on the left, had a smear of something on his chin. The other one was staring at Clara with the unblinking concentration of a child who has decided to form an opinion and is still gathering data. "My boys don't go to school," Cole said. "I noticed. Their mother's been gone 2 years. They haven't had any regular schooling." Clara waited. He looked back at the hotel. His jaw moved slightly, like he was working through something uncomfortable. "I can't take on a housekeeper or a live-in woman. That's not what this would be. You'd have your own room in the bunkhouse, separate from the house. The work would be teaching, some cooking when it's needed, keeping the place from falling apart. I don't have money to pay much." "How much?" He named a figure. It was not impressive, but it was a roof, and it was food, and it was not a town that had already decided who she was before she'd spoken a word. "When would you need an answer?" Clara asked. "Now." He said it without apology. "I need to get back to the ranch before it gets dark. You'd come with me today or not at all?" She thought about the room upstairs with the broken window latch. She thought about the man called Pete and the way the bartender had looked at his glass. She thought about $11 and the arithmetic that led nowhere good. She looked at the two boys again. The one who'd been staring at her hadn't looked away. She couldn't tell if that was judgment or curiosity or something else entirely. "I'll get my trunk," she said. His name was Cole Mercer, and he was not a talkative man. She learned this over the course of the 4-hour wagon ride out to the ranch, during which he spoke approximately 40 words total. The boys spoke 0. The three of them sat on the bench seat with Clara wedged between Cole and the edge, the boys in the wagon bed behind them, and they rode through country that got wilder and lonelier the further they went from town until the last visible sign of other human beings, a fence post, a worn trail, disappeared entirely, and it was just grass and sky and the sound of the horses. "What are their names?" she asked, somewhere around the second hour. "Noah and Levi." "Which is which?" "Noah's the one who stares, Levi fidgets." She turned carefully to look at the boys behind her. They were both sitting with their backs to the cab, facing the road they'd come from. Neither of them was doing anything in particular. "They're quiet," she said. "Yes." "Have they always been, or since their mother died?" He said it the way he said everything, without inflection, without performance, like he'd said it so many times to himself that the words had worn smooth. But something in his shoulders shifted slightly, a tension that came and went. "I'm sorry," Claire said. "Don't be. You didn't cause it." She turned back to face the road. The sun was getting low and turning everything orange and amber, and the shadows of the grasses were long across the ground. It was beautiful in the way that empty places are beautiful. Not comfortable, not safe, but undeniably vast. "What happened to her?" Clara asked, because she was the kind of woman who asked things she probably shouldn't. Cole was quiet long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. "Fire," he said. "House fire. 3 years ago. Boys saw it happen." The word landed like a stone in still water. "I'm sorry," she said again, and this time she meant it differently. Not the automatic social courtesy, but something actual, something that came from understanding what that kind of grief looked like in small boys who had gone quiet. Cole didn't respond. But she noticed, in the periphery of her vision, that his hands on the reins had loosened slightly. The ranch was called Mercer Flat, which was a functional name for a functional place. No romanticism about it. No attempt to make it sound like something it wasn't. It sat in a shallow valley between two ridges, bordered on the east by a creek that was running low in the summer heat. The main house was solid, if not large, built from timber that had aged to gray, 2 stories, a covered porch that wrapped the front and one side. There was a barn, a bunkhouse, a smokehouse, a chicken yard, and a kitchen garden that was currently somewhere between surviving and thriving, with the balance tipped toward surviving. Everything was functional. Nothing was decorative. Nothing was comfortable in the way that things are comfortable when someone has had time to attend to comfort. It had the feeling of a place where a woman had once made choices about curtains and where to put the rocking chair, and then those choices had stopped, and no one had made new ones. Clara stood in the yard with her trunk and looked at it for a long moment. "Bunkhouse is over there," Cole said, gesturing. It's not fancy. There's a cot and a washstand and a stove. It'll keep weather out. It's fine, she said. House rules. He turned to face her, and he was doing that thing again. The flat, practical assessment, like he was inventorying a situation. Boys eat breakfast at 6, school starts at 7, midday meal at noon. I'm in the fields from first light till dark, so if something breaks or goes wrong, you'll handle it yourself until I'm back. If there's a threat, animal or otherwise, there's a rifle in the house above the door. You know how to shoot? No. I'll teach you. He said it like that was settled and moved on. I don't want any hired hands in the bunkhouse when you're there. I'll tell them to clear out. There's 2 of them, Hatch and the old man, Dupree. Dupree's harmless. Hatch is... He paused. Hatch keeps to himself. Just stay clear of him, and he'll do the same. Understood. Last thing. He looked at her directly then, and she looked back, and she thought she understood something about what he needed her to understand. I'm not looking for anything other than what I told you. You're here to teach my boys and keep the house functional. That's the arrangement. That's the whole arrangement. Yes, she said. It's the same for me. He nodded once, the matter closed, and went to see to the horses. Yeah. The bunkhouse was exactly what he'd described. Not fancy, not comfortable, but solid. The cot had a reasonable mattress and 2 blankets. The stove was small but functional. The washstand held a chipped basin and a pitcher that held water. She unpacked her trunk in the fading light, shaking out her dresses and hanging them on the pegs someone had driven into the wall. She set her hairbrush on the washstand and her small stack of books, a reader, a grammar book, a mathematics primer, on the shelf above the stove. She changed out of her traveling clothes and into her plain brown dress. Then she sat on the edge of the cot and let herself feel, for a few minutes, exactly how frightened she was. Not of Cole Mercer, who had intervened in a situation he had no obligation to involve himself in and had spoken to her with more basic courtesy than anyone else in Harlan Creek. Not of the ranch or the work or the isolation. She was frightened of how close she had come to having nothing, $11 and a broken window latch, in a town that had already assigned her a story she hadn't written. She was frightened of how easily that could have gone wrong, and of how many ways it still could. She sat with that fear for about 5 minutes. Then she stood up, splashed water on her face, and went to find the kitchen so she'd know where everything was by morning. Noah and Levi Mercer were, as their father had indicated, deeply silent children. They appeared at the table at 6 o'clock exactly the next morning, already dressed, their hair combed with the care of boys who have learned to do these things for themselves. They sat across from each other and looked at their plates and did not speak. Claire set oatmeal in front of them and sat down with her own bowl and said, "Good morning." Silence. "I'm going to be your teacher. My name is Miss Whitmore. You can call me that, or you can call me Miss Clara, whichever feels easier." She paused. "You don't have to talk to me this morning, but I'm going to talk to you because I find silence uncomfortable and I've never been good at sitting in it." Noah, the one who stared, looked up from his bowl. His eyes were his father's eyes, that dark river water color, in a boy's face that still had softness in it. Levi kept eating, but his shoulders were a little less rigid than they'd been when he sat down. "What do you already know?" Claire asked. "Academically, reading, writing, numbers. What have you been taught?" Silence. "All right, here's what I propose. After breakfast, we'll do a short exercise. Reading first, then numbers. That'll show me what you know. Then I'll have a better idea of what we need to work on. Does that seem reasonable?" Noah put his spoon down. "Our last teacher left after 2 weeks," he said. His voice was gravelly and quiet, like someone who used it rarely and didn't entirely trust it. "What was his name?" "Mr. Fenwick." "Why did he leave?" Noah looked at his brother. Levi kept eating, but something about his jaw was different, tighter. "He said we were too much trouble," Noah said. Clara put her own spoon down. She looked at both of them. Really looked, the way she hadn't been able to on the wagon because she'd been trying not to stare. They were thin in the way children get thin when they've had months of plain, functional food and no one with time to pay attention to what they ate. Their hands were calloused for children their age. They had the self-contained quality of people who have learned that making needs known tends to result in disappointment. "I've been told I'm trouble too," Claire said, "on multiple occasions. So perhaps we'll suit each other." Levi set his spoon down. He looked at her for the first time directly, and she saw something in his face. Not a smile, not warmth, but a kind of assessment, like the question, "Are you real?" was being put to her in silence. She met his eyes and didn't look away. He went back to his oatmeal, but the set of his shoulders was different now, just slightly, just enough. Cole Mercer, she discovered over the following days, was a man of extreme efficiency and limited words, which turned out not to be the same thing as coldness. He left before she woke each morning, which meant she never saw him at breakfast. He appeared at midday looking like he'd been working in a field, which he had, ate whatever was on the table with the focused attention of a man who hasn't stopped to eat all morning, and returned to work inside of 20 minutes. He appeared again at supper, washed up, quieter than before, and ate whatever the day had left him. He asked his sons about their schooling with the same directness he applied to everything. What did you learn today? What gave you trouble? Did you finish the reading? He listened to their answers, and they did answer, in their abbreviated way, a sentence here, a sentence there, with full attention, and he responded to what they actually said rather than what he'd expected to hear. Then he went to do the evening work, and Clara went to the bunkhouse, and the day ended. It was on the fourth day that she saw him stop. She had been working with the boys on the porch because the light was better outside, and she'd set them a writing exercise, a page of letters, formation practice, while she was planning the next week's reading list. She'd looked up to check Noah's grip on his pencil and caught sight of Cole at the far end of the yard, standing by the fence, looking at nothing in particular, just standing there. The late afternoon light made everything look a little temporary, a little like it might not be there if you looked away. He stood there for maybe 3 minutes. Then he turned and went back into the barn. She didn't say anything about it. She didn't think there was anything to say, but she filed it away. That image of a man standing alone in a yard he'd built, with everything he had left in the world inside the fence around him, just standing in the light. A week into her time at Mercer Flat, she made the acquaintance of Dupree, the older of the two hired hands, who turned out to be exactly as Cole had described. A small, weathered man in his 60s who spoke slowly, moved slowly, and seemed to have arrived at a place in life where nothing was going to rush him. He was the kind of man who knew every task on a ranch in the way that came from doing those tasks for 40 years, and he performed them with unhurried competence and almost no conversation. Hatch was something else. She encountered him on the 8th morning, coming around the corner of the barn while she was heading to the garden to see if any of the tomatoes had come in. He was perhaps 30, big across the shoulders, with a face that had taken some damage, a broken nose set crooked, a scar through one eyebrow, and eyes that moved over her in the same way the bartender's eyes had moved over her in Harlan Creek. He didn't say anything. He just looked at her for a moment too long and then kept walking. Clara went to the garden and assessed the tomatoes and told herself it was nothing. Men looked at women. That was the world. But she noted it, and she made sure to know, after that, where Hatch was in the yard before she crossed it alone. On the 10th day it rained. A summer storm had been building since noon, the kind that comes in fast off the mountains with no ceremony, just a sudden darkness, and then the sky opening up. By the time Clara got the boys inside and their schoolwork put away, the rain was coming down hard enough to fill the creek up noticeably and turn the yard into a shallow pond. Cole came in from the field an hour earlier than usual, soaked through and short-tempered in the way that people are short-tempered when things have gone wrong they had no control over. He came in the back door of the kitchen while Clara was making coffee and said, "How bad is it out there?" "I haven't been out there," she said. "I was keeping the boys inside." He crossed to the window and looked out. "Pasture fence is going to flood. I need to move the horses before—" He stopped, looked at the coffee, looked at her. "Is that ready?" 5 minutes. He sat down at the table with his hat in his hands and his coat dripping on the floor and said nothing for a moment. The boys had migrated in from the main room and were sitting on the floor near the stove, nominally working on their reading, but actually watching their father. "Pasture flooded last year, too," Noah said without looking up. "The gray mare kicked through a fence board." "She kicked through this year, too," Cole said. "I'm going to trade her for something with a better temperament." "You said that last year," Levi said. Cole looked at him. Something moved across his face. Not quite a smile, but the shape a smile would take in a man who didn't make them easily. "I know I did. Clara poured the coffee and set it on the table and went back to the window to watch the rain. Behind her, she could hear Cole drink, hear the boys settle back into their reading, hear the sound of rain on the roof and the distant sound of unhappy horses. It was not comfortable exactly, but it was something. It was a kitchen with people in it, and coffee that was hot, and children doing their lessons, and rain that would be done by morning. She hadn't expected it to feel like anything. Says 3 weeks in, she understood two things that she hadn't understood coming in. The first was that Noah and Levi were not troubled children in the way that Mr. Fenwick must have meant. They were wounded children, which is different. Troubled children push back, wounded children pull in. They had pulled in so far that most people who tried to reach them got tired and left, which confirmed the wound, which made them pull in further. The pattern was self-sustaining. What they needed was not a teacher who would be patient in a performing kind of way. Look at me, being patient. But one who would simply persist without making a production of it. Who would show up the same way every day until the weight of reliability started to mean something. Clara had persistence in some abundance. She came from a line of women who had survived things, and persistence was what survival looked like from the inside. The second thing she understood was that Cole Mercer was not going to make this easy or uncomplicated, and not because of anything he did or didn't do toward her specifically, but because the man was carrying grief the way some men carry injuries, quietly, completely, without asking anyone to account for it, in a way that was fundamentally both admirable and unsustainable. He had built a life around the boys and the ranch and the daily requirements of keeping both operational. He had filled in every hour with necessity, and the strategy was working, roughly. The boys were alive, the ranch was functional, he was upright, but the cost of it was visible in him if you knew how to look. She knew how to look. She'd grown up in a house like that. She didn't say any of this to anyone, but she noted it, the way she noted everything. The trouble when it came arrived not from any direction she'd expected. She had known, somewhere in the back of her mind, that the situation in Harlan Creek was not finished. She had walked away from a difficult moment in a small town, and small towns had long memories and longer grudges. She had not anticipated how quickly or from what direction the past would follow her out here. She was in the yard with the boys. They were working on a long division problem she'd chalked on a board she'd propped against the fence, and Noah was almost smiling, which was still rare enough to be noteworthy, when she heard horses, 3 of them, coming up the wagon road from the direction of town. She straightened up and looked, shading her eyes against the afternoon sun. She recognized the man in the middle before she recognized the situation. A heavy-set man in a good suit who had the particular bearing of someone who had money and had never learned to wear it lightly. He had ridden with 2 other men, both of whom had the hard-used look of men hired to present options to people who didn't want to listen. She'd learned his name in her 3rd day in Harlan Creek, when she'd seen him going into the land office. Victor Aldane. He owned half of the businesses on the main street, and according to Dupree, was currently in a dispute with Cole over water rights to the creek that ran through Mercer Flat. The boys had gone still beside her, the way animals go still when they sense something wrong. "Go inside," she said quietly. "Miss Whitmore," Noah started. "Go inside, please. Now." They went. She stayed where she was. Aldane pulled up his horse at the yard gate and looked at her with the mild, settled contempt of a man who considers himself unhurried. "You must be the new arrangement," he said. "Mercer's gotten domestic." "He's in the field," Clara said. "If you have business with him, I'd suggest coming back when he's available." "I'll wait." He didn't get off his horse. She looked at the 2 men flanking him. One of them had his thumbs hooked in his belt in a way that was meant to communicate something. She understood what it was meant to communicate and filed it away. "Suit yourself," she said, and went back to cleaning the chalk off the board. Her hands were steady. She made them stay that way. Aldane waited. She could feel his eyes on her back, which was a familiar sensation and not a pleasant one. Cole came back from the field 45 minutes later. She heard the change in the yard before she saw it. The particular quality of silence that descends when 2 men who have unfinished business with each other are in the same space. She was in the kitchen by then, had sent the boys upstairs for their afternoon reading, and she stood near the window where she could hear without being visible. "Aldane," Cole said. His voice was level. "Mercer." Aldane's voice had a different quality now, smooth, almost pleasant, the way people sound when they've decided the outcome in advance. I've had a new survey run on the creek boundary. I've seen your survey. I've had my own done. Your surveyor is mistaken. So is yours. A pause. I'm prepared to purchase the eastern 20 acres, Eldane said. Fair market price. You could use the cash. I don't want to sell. Think about it carefully. Another pause, and Clara could hear in it the shape of a threat being declined. You're out here alone, Mercer. Boys need more than you can give them. Life gets complicated. Get off my property, Cole said. Not loudly. The way you say something when you mean it so completely, that volume would be redundant. She heard horses moving. She heard the gate. She stayed at the window until the sound of hooves faded. Then Cole came in the back door. He stood for a moment with his back to her, taking his hat off, running a hand through his hair. When he turned around, his face was arranged carefully into something neutral. You heard that, he said. I was nearby. He pulled out the table chair and sat down heavily. Aldane's been after that land for 2 years. He's got a stake in the rail company, and the rail company wants the creek for a water stop. He was talking to himself as much as to her. He's used the courts before, tied a man up in litigation for 18 months until the man couldn't afford the legal fees anymore and sold just to end it. Can he do that to you? Cole was quiet for a moment. He can try. Clara turned to put the kettle on because the situation called for something to do with her hands. What's the state of your deed? Clean, filed proper in 79. And the survey? My surveyor, a man named Greaves out of Billings, put the boundary 40 feet east of where Aldane's man put it. 40 feet doesn't sound like much. It's the difference between the creek running through my property or his. Then you need documentation, she said. Every survey reading, every record of creek use, any correspondence you have with Aldane. You need it organized and ready if he takes it to court. Cole looked at her. She had her back to him, filling the kettle at the pump. You know something about legal proceedings? He said. My father had a property dispute in Ohio. Ran for 6 years. I learned more about deed law than I ever wanted to know. She set the kettle on the stove. Do you have everything filed somewhere accessible? Mostly. Mostly isn't good enough if he moves fast. Cole studied her for a moment. That same flat assessment he'd used on the saloon boardwalk in Harlan Creek, like he was recalibrating something. All right, he said. They spent 2 evenings going through Cole's papers, deed, survey records, correspondence, old receipts showing cattle watered from the creek for years back. Clara organized everything into chronological order and made a second copy of the most important documents in her careful schoolteacher handwriting. She noted the gaps and told Cole what he'd need to fill them. She didn't say much while they worked. He didn't either. The boys were in bed and the house was quiet except for the paper sounds and the lamp hissing, and occasionally one of them saying, "Here," or "This one goes before that one," or "You'll want to note that date." On the second night, when they were nearly done, Cole said, without looking up from the letter he was reading, "You didn't have to do this." "I know. It's not what I hired you for. You hired me to keep the place from falling apart," she said. "This qualifies." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, still not looking up, "Why did Pruitt call it off?" She hadn't expected that. It was the first time anyone had asked her directly, rather than speculating around her. "I don't know," she said. "He didn't explain." Cole was quiet. "It happens," she said, because she needed to say something. "Men change their minds. Women change their minds too. It wasn't a tragedy. It was just unexpected. You came a long way on someone else's word." "I did." He set the letter down and looked at her directly. "That takes something," he said, "coming that far on a word." "Desperation, mostly." "No." He shook his head slightly. "I know what desperation looks like. That's something else." She didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing. She straightened the stack of papers in front of her and put the organizing clip on top. "I think that's everything," she said. He looked at the organized stack and then back at his property. Out the window, at the dark yard, and the shapes of the barn and the chicken house and the fence he'd built. At the small kingdom that was being threatened by a man who wanted it for a railroad water stop. "Thank you," he said. It was only 2 words, but the way he said them made her understand that he didn't say them often, and that when he did, he meant them completely. "You're welcome," she said. And she picked up her lamp and went back to the bunkhouse, walking carefully across the dark yard, listening to the creek running low somewhere in the distance and the horses shifting in the barn. She lay down on her cot and looked at the ceiling and thought, this is a family. Not hers. Not yet. Maybe never. But it was a family, and someone had to look after it, and for the moment, inexplicably, impossibly, that someone was her. She turned over and closed her eyes and slept better than she had since Cincinnati. The documents stayed organized in the tin box under Cole's desk, and Clara didn't mention them again. That was the thing about useful work. It either spoke for itself or it didn't, and explaining it afterward only made it smaller. Life at Mercer Flat settled into a shape that was not comfortable exactly, but functional in the way that things are functional when everyone involved has decided to stop fighting the arrangement and just live inside it. Clara was up before 6, had the stove going and breakfast on the table by the time the boys came down, and school started at 7 on the porch, when the weather allowed, and at the kitchen table when it didn't. Cole left before any of it began and returned to the edges of it, midday, evening, like a man orbiting something he wasn't sure how to enter. She noticed that he always asked the boys what they'd done. Never did you behave or did you give her trouble, or always what did you do today? What did you learn? It was a small thing. She suspected he didn't know he did it. Noah had begun to talk more. Not freely. He wasn't a freely talking child, and she didn't think he'd ever been, even before. But he had started asking questions during their lessons that went beyond the immediate material. They would be working through a passage in the reader, and he'd look up and say something like, "Why did the man go back if he knew it was dangerous? Or is that how rivers actually work?" His mind moved sideways across information, made connections she hadn't prompted, found angles she found genuinely interesting. She told him so once, and he'd looked at her with an expression so carefully neutral that she understood she'd said something that mattered, and he was not yet sure what to do with it mattering. Levi was different. Levi was precise where Noah was lateral. He wanted to get things exactly right, would redo an arithmetic problem 4 times until the numbers sat the way he felt they should, would practice a letter formation until it matched the example perfectly, or give up entirely because anything less than perfect felt, to him, like failure. That was the thing Clara had to work around with Levi. Not stubbornness, though it looked like stubbornness from the outside. It was something closer to fear. The fear that imperfect work was the same as worthless work, which was the fear of a child who had learned early that the margin for error was very small. She didn't address it directly. Direct approaches with Levi tended to make him lock up entirely. Instead, she started making deliberate small mistakes in her own work, writing a wrong sum on the board, misspelling a word in her instructions, and then catching them aloud. "Oh, I've got that wrong. Let me fix it." No ceremony, no embarrassment, just wrong, corrected, moved on. It took about 2 weeks before Levi crossed out a wrong answer instead of crumpling the whole page. She considered it one of the more significant things that had happened since she'd arrived. The morning she found the burned foundation was an accident. She'd gone looking for the boys, who had finished their breakfast and disappeared before she could give them their morning reading assignment, which was not unusual. They had a habit of evaporating when the weather was good. And she'd tracked them east of the barn, past the chicken yard, to a section of the property she hadn't had reason to visit before. She came around the corner of a stand of cottonwoods and stopped. The foundation was roughly 30 by 40 feet, stone and charred timber, the remains of what had been a larger house than the one currently standing. The stone was still solid. Whoever had built it to last. But everything above foundation height had burned, and what remained was a blackened skeleton. Weeds had grown up through the interior, and someone had at some point cleared the worst of the debris, but the bones of it were still visible. A door frame with no door, a section of wall no higher than Clara's shoulder, the ghost of a staircase going nowhere. Noah and Levi were sitting inside it, just sitting on a low section of remaining wall, not talking, not doing anything, watching something in the grass that Clara couldn't see from where she stood. She stood very still for a moment. Then she walked forward, around to where there had once been a front door, and stepped through the frame into the ruined space. The boys looked up at her. Neither of them moved to leave. "What are you looking at?" she asked. Noah pointed. In the weeds near the far wall, a killdeer had made a nest in the debris. 4 eggs, pale and spotted, tucked into a hollow where someone's floorboards used to be. She's been sitting on them for a week, Noah said. The eggs. She got mad at us the first day, Levi said. When we got too close. She does this thing. He made a gesture, a kind of floppy dragging motion. She drags her wing and runs away from the nest so you follow her instead of finding the eggs. That's what they do, Clara said. Kill deer. They fake an injury to lead predators away from the nest. Levi looked at her. Do they know they're doing it? Or is it just what happens? It was, Clara thought, an unusually good question for an 8-year-old. I don't know, she said honestly. I think probably they just do it, but whether they know or not, it works. She sat down on the section of wall beside them, uninvited, and looked at the bird who was watching them all with the bright, suspicious eye of something that has survived by being more careful than everything around it. They sat there for a while. The morning was warm and the cottonwood leaves moved and the bird watched and nobody said anything about what the building had been. She built it for him, Levi said abruptly. Clara looked at him. The first house. Mama built it. She picked where it should go and she picked what kind of wood, and she had it bigger than this one because she said, He stopped. Something moved across his face, something unsettled and young. She said the house should be bigger than what you need so there's room for what comes. Clara kept her eyes on the bird. She did not look at Levi. She'd learned that with both of them. If you looked directly at something tender, they'd close up around it. You had to approach it sideways, let it be set into the middle distance. She sounds like she was smart, Clara said. She was. Noah's voice was factual, the way children state things that are both absolutely true and absolutely unbearable. She was smarter than Papa. Don't tell him I said that, Levi said immediately. I wouldn't, Clara said. They sat a little longer. The killdeer ruffled her feathers and settled back into her eggs with the focused determination of something that has no option but to keep going. Does your father know you come here? Clara asked. The silence before Noah answered was its own kind of answer. He doesn't come out this way, he said. Understood, Clara said. She stood up, straightened her skirt, and looked at the two of them, 8 years old, sitting in their mother's burned house watching a bird protect something fragile by pretending to be broken. Reading assignment after lunch, she said. Chapter 7. Don't be late. She walked back the way she'd come and didn't look back. And she didn't say anything to Cole, because some things a person has a right to keep private even when they're not keeping them from you specifically. Just so. The incident with Hatch happened on a Tuesday. Clara had been at the ranch 6 weeks by then, long enough to have established a routine, and long enough to have become, if not invisible, at least expected. She went to the well each morning for fresh water before the household was up, filled the kitchen pitchers, and generally had the first half hour of each day to herself, which she valued. Hatch was at the well when she got there. He didn't appear to be doing anything in particular. He was leaning against the well housing with a cup of coffee, watching the sun come over the eastern ridge, which was a reasonable thing to do. She would have given him that if he'd acknowledged her presence and moved aside. But he didn't move. He watched her come across the yard with the same slow, measuring attention he'd watched her with the first time. And when she reached the well and reached for the bucket rope, he put his hand over hers on the handle. Not hard, not rough, just a hand over hers. She looked at it. Then she looked at him. I've got it, she said. I'll get it for you, he said pleasantly. I can manage, thank you. She kept her voice level and moved to take the handle back. He didn't move his hand. She looked at him for a long moment and made a decision. Mr. Hatch, she said, I'd like you to take your hand off mine. Just being neighborly. Take your hand off mine or I will make sure Mr. Mercer hears about this conversation within the hour. Something changed in his expression. He looked at her with less pleasantness and more calculation, and she understood that the calculation had just concluded that she was not worth the specific trouble this would cause him. He lifted his hand, stepped back. She drew the water herself. She carried it back to the house with both hands steady and her heart pounding and said nothing about it to anyone for approximately 4 hours. At which point she told Cole. She found him in the barn in the late afternoon, restringing a fence line that had come loose in a previous storm. She waited until he'd set down his tools and looked at her. I need to tell you something about Hatch, she said. She told him plainly exactly what had happened. No dramatization, no suggestion that it had been worse than it was. Just the facts. The well, the handle, what she'd said, what he'd said, what she'd done. Cole listened without interrupting. When she finished, his expression hadn't changed perceptibly, but there was something different about the quality of his stillness. "He didn't hurt you," he said. It wasn't a question, but it wasn't not a question. "No, but I thought you should know." "Yes." A pause. "I'll deal with it. I'm not asking you to dismiss him on my account. I can manage Hatch. I just wanted you to know what the situation is." Cole looked at her steadily. "You shouldn't have to manage Hatch," he said. "That's not something you should have to do." She had not expected that specific answer and wasn't entirely sure what to do with it. "All right," she said. "Thank you for telling me." She nodded and went back to the house. By the following morning, Hatch was gone. Cole said nothing about it beyond hired hand moved on when the boys asked at breakfast, and Dupree appeared entirely unsurprised, and the matter was closed. The thing she thought about afterward was not the incident with Hatch, which she'd already filed away in the category of things she'd handled, but the way Cole had said that's not something you should have to do. He'd said it with the same flatness he said everything, which meant she had no way to gauge the weight behind it. But she spent more time than she'd expected thinking about the fact that he'd said it at all. Late July brought a heat that settled over the valley like something physical and refused to move. The creek dropped another 6 inches. The kitchen garden threatened to give up entirely, and Clara spent her evenings watering it by hand, bucket by bucket, because the alternative was no tomatoes, no beans, and very little to supplement the salt meat Cole brought back from the trading post. The boys took their lessons on the shaded side of the house and drank more water than Clara had thought children could hold. And in the worst of the afternoon heat, she suspended formal schoolwork and let them do whatever they wanted, which turned out to be, after about 3 days of testing whether she meant it, following Dupree around and asking him questions. Dupree, it turned out, was an excellent teacher for certain things. He knew how to fix a pump and shoe a horse and read weather by the color of a sky. He knew the names of every native grass in the valley, and which ones the cattle would eat first and which ones they'd avoid. He knew how to make a repair last, and how to spot the difference between something that needed fixing now and something that could wait. He let the boys follow him without comment. He answered their questions in his slow, unhurried way, and didn't talk down to them, and didn't seem to notice when their questions were good, which made them ask more. Clara watched this from a distance, and felt something that was not quite envy and not quite affection. Something between the two, watching old skill pass sideways into young hands without ceremony. It was during the second week of the heat that she finally got Levi to laugh. She hadn't been trying to. That was probably why it worked. They were doing their reading, and she'd selected a passage from a collection of folk stories that she'd thought might hold his attention, and the story happened to have a scene in which a man tried to catch a pig in a marketplace and failed comprehensively, and she'd read it without performing it, just reading it straight the way you read things. And Levi had made a sound. It was small, it was brief, it was nothing like the full laugh of an uncomplicated child. But it was something, and she kept reading without reacting to it, because she'd learned that with Levi you did not acknowledge the good thing directly, or he'd treat it like a trap and pull back from it. You just let it happen, and kept going. That evening at supper, when Cole asked what they'd done that day, Levi said without any particular inflection, "We read about a man chasing a pig. Was it interesting?" Cole asked. "It was funny," Levi said, also without inflection, as if funny were a weather report. Cole looked at Clara briefly. She looked at her plate. "Glad to hear it," Cole said. August came and the heat began to break at the edges. Still hot by midday, but cool enough in the mornings to breathe properly. The killdeer eggs had hatched, and Noah had observed this with the gravity of a small scientist and reported every detail of it to Clara. 4 chicks, impossibly small, running on legs like wire by the second day, following their mother in a line through the burned foundation. He had found, in the process, that the old foundation made excellent habitat for several species of beetle he'd never seen before, and he'd spent a week cataloging them with a piece of charcoal on brown paper that Clara had given him, drawing each one with a care and precision she hadn't seen him apply to formal schoolwork. She let him keep the drawings. She noted privately that he'd numbered them and added observational notes beside each one. This one moves fast when threatened, and found 2 of these under the same stone, and she began to wonder what kind of mind was going to emerge from this boy if it had room to develop. It was in the second week of August that she and Cole had their first real argument. It started over the arithmetic textbook. She told Cole in one of their brief evening exchanges that Noah and Levi were beyond what the primer she'd brought could offer, that both of them needed more advanced material, and that she'd like to order books from Billings when the next supply order went in. Cole had said he'd think about it. A week had passed, and nothing had been ordered. She asked again. He said the same thing. On the third time, she'd sat down across from him at the kitchen table after the boys were in bed and said plainly, "The books. I'd like a decision." He looked up from the harness he was mending. "I said I'd think about it." "You've been thinking about it for 3 weeks. In that time, Noah has done every problem in the primer twice. He's bored, and a bored Noah is a Noah who disappears into that burned foundation for 3 hours when he should be working. The books cost money. I know they cost money. I'm not asking for frivolous things. I'm asking for an arithmetic book and a grammar that isn't 5 years old. When I have the money, I'll order them." "When is that likely to be?" He set the harness down and looked at her, and there was something in his face that was neither the flat neutral expression nor the brief glimpse of warmth she'd seen at moments, something rougher and more unguarded. "I don't know, Miss Whitmore. I've got a water rights dispute with a man who has more lawyers than I have fence posts, and a hay crop that came in thin, and a pump in the south pasture that's failing. I'm managing what I can manage." "I understand that," Clara said. "I'm not asking you to rearrange your priorities. I'm asking you to put 2 books on the next Billings order. If the money's genuinely not there, tell me that directly, and I'll find another way." "What other way?" "I'll write to the Territorial Education Office. There are programs for frontier families. I looked into it when I was organizing your papers." He stared at her. "You looked into it." "I had time in the evenings." A silence stretched between them. Something moved across his face that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite something else she couldn't name. "You don't have to run things here," he said. "That's not what I asked you to do." "I know it isn't." "Then why?" "Because the boys need the books," she said, "and because I can write the letter and solve the problem, and that seems preferable to not solving it." She paused. "I'm not trying to take something over. I'm trying to do my job." He was quiet for a long moment. The lamp hissed. Outside, a coyote ran something across the ridge. "Write the letter," he said. He picked up the harness. "If they send the books, good. If they don't, I'll find the money somewhere." She stood up. "Thank you." "You're going to do what you think needs doing regardless," he said, not unkindly. "I'd rather know about it." She almost said something to that and then didn't. She went to the bunkhouse and lay down on her cot and stared at the ceiling and thought about whether he was right, and concluded that he probably was, and wasn't sure how to feel about that. "What?" The letter went out with the next week's mail. A response came back inside of 3 weeks. 2 arithmetic texts, 1 grammar, 1 reader, compliments of the Montana Territorial Education Fund for Frontier Children. The package arrived the same day Clara came back from the garden to find Noah sitting at the kitchen table with a question mark drawn on his paper beside a long division problem, waiting for her with the particular impatience of a child who has hit a wall and would prefer not to stay there. She handed him the new arithmetic book. He opened it, turned to a page in the middle, and went still in the way children go still when something lands exactly right. Cole came in for his midday meal and found Clara at the stove and both boys at the table with their heads down over new books. He didn't say anything. He sat down and looked at the table and then at her. She handed him a plate and said nothing about it. He ate. He looked at the boys. He looked back at his plate. "Good," he said finally, quietly. Not to her, not to the boys, just said it, into the middle of the kitchen, like he was confirming something to himself. She took that for what it was and moved on. It was a Thursday evening in early September when Clara first understood how complete the grief was. She'd been in the kitchen past the hour she usually retired, working through a lesson plan by lamplight, when she heard Cole come in the back door. Not the kitchen door, the side door that opened to the small passage between the kitchen and the main room. She heard him stop. Then she heard him say softly something that might have been a word or might have been just a sound. She waited. She heard him sit down on the floor of the passage. Just sit down, the way you sit when your legs go from under you, with a sound that was not loud but was complete. She stood at the kitchen door for a moment. She did not open it. She understood something about what was happening on the other side of that door. This was the anniversary of something, she didn't know exactly what, Didn't know the date of the fire that had taken his wife and gutted his older house and changed the shape of everything. But she knew from the quality of the sound and from the way he'd been carrying himself all week, moving a little slower, speaking a little less, that this was a hard week in a recurring way. She went back to the table. She brewed a second pot of coffee, louder than necessary so he'd hear it if he wanted to know she was there. She sat down with her lesson planning and worked until the lamplight started getting unsteady. At some point, she didn't hear him move. He moved quietly when he wanted to. Cole appeared in the kitchen doorway. He looked like a man who hadn't slept in several nights. His face was open in a way she'd not seen before, without the careful arrangement he usually maintained, and she saw the full weight of it for a moment before he gathered himself. "Didn't know you were still up," he said. "There's coffee," she said. Not, "Are you all right?" or "I heard you," or anything that would require him to acknowledge what had just happened. He came and sat at the table and poured himself a cup and sat with both hands around it. They sat there for a while. The lamp burned low, and neither of them moved to trim it. "Her name was May," he said, after a long time. Clara kept her eyes on her papers. She built the first house herself. Well, with help. But she designed it. She had very particular ideas about where the windows should go. She argued with the man I hired to frame it for 3 days about the angle of one window in the kitchen because she knew exactly how the afternoon light would come in and she didn't want it any other way. He paused. She was right about it. The light came in exactly like she said it would. Clara said nothing. She was very careful not to say anything, not to offer comfort or acknowledgement in a way that would make him feel observed. "Boys were 5 when it happened," he said. "I was in the barn. There was—" He stopped. His hands tightened around the cup. "I got them out. I didn't get her out. There's not a version of that where I understand what I could have done differently, and there's not a version where that stops mattering." "No," Clara said, "there isn't." He looked at her. She looked back. "I don't know what you're supposed to say to that," he said. "Neither do I," she said. "I don't think you're supposed to say anything. I think it's just true and you have to carry it." Something shifted in his face. Not relief, not something that clean, but something like the specific exhale of a person who has been braced for something and found that the thing was less terrible than expected. "May would have liked you," he said. He said it like a fact, not like a compliment. Clara thought about the woman who had argued about window angles for 3 days. "I think I'd have liked her too," she said. Cole finished his coffee and stood. He didn't say anything else, just put his cup on the counter and went upstairs. She heard his footsteps cross the ceiling, heard the particular creak that was his bedroom door, and then nothing. She sat at the table a little longer in the quiet house and thought about what it meant to love something the way that man loved the life he'd built and kept losing. And she thought about the 2 boys sleeping upstairs who had their father's eyes and their mother's burned house, and the whole long frontier ahead of them, which was going to require more than any of them currently had, but might, if things held, be navigable. She thought about the killdeer who faked a broken wing to draw danger away from her nest, whether it knew what it was doing or whether it just did it. She thought that sometimes those were the same thing. She put out the lamp and crossed the yard to the bunkhouse in the dark, knowing the path by feel now, and lay down on her cot, and thought that she was further from Cincinnati than any measurement of miles could accurately express. Victor Aldane came back in the second week of September. This time he came alone. Clara saw him ride up from the kitchen window, and something in the deliberateness of his arrival, midday, when Cole would be farthest from the house, riding slowly, told her this was intentional. She dried her hands on her apron and went to the front door. "Mr. Mercer's in the south field," she said, before he'd fully dismounted. "I'm not here for Mercer," Aldane said. He tied his horse to the porch rail with the ease of a man who goes where he likes. "I heard he's taken on a school teacher. That's correct?" "Must be lonely work out here," he said. "Isolated." "Not particularly." He smiled, and the smile was the same kind as the one Pete had used in the saloon. Pleasant enough on its surface, with something underneath that was neither pleasant nor subtle. "I can offer you a position in Harlan Creek. Better pay than whatever Mercer's managing. Real schoolhouse when we get it built. Town's growing." "I'm not interested," Clara said. "Think it over." "I have. The answer is no." Something hardened behind his eyes. "You're loyal to a man you've known 2 months. I'm not being loyal, she said. I'm doing my job. And you're standing on his porch without an invitation, which I'd suggest reconsidering. Aldane looked at her for a long moment with the particular expression of a man who is deciding whether she's going to be a problem or whether she's going to understand her position. He seemed to arrive at a conclusion. You think you know what you're involved in, he said. You don't. I expect you're right, Clara said pleasantly. But I know what I'm doing, and I'm going to keep doing it. Good day, Mr. Aldane. She went back inside and shut the door. She stood in the kitchen with her back to the wall and her heart doing something unruly in her chest and listened to his horse move out of the yard. Then she went to Cole's desk, pulled out the tin box with the documents, and added a note to the paper she kept inside it. Aldane visited, September 12th, midday, without Mercer present. Said he had an offer for me. I declined. His manner was threatening. C.W. She put the tin box back under the desk. She went to make sure the boys hadn't heard anything, found them at their lesson books on the porch, undisturbed, and stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment. Outside, the late summer light was going gold across the valley. The creek was still low. The horses moved in the near pasture, and somewhere across the ridge, a hawk was working a thermal in wide, unhurried circles. It was a good piece of land, she thought, worth fighting for. She went back to the kitchen and started on the evening meal, and when Cole came in at dusk, she told him about Aldane's visit. In the same plain way she told him everything, and watched his face go through a series of small, controlled expressions, and waited. He offered you money to leave, Cole said. Yes. And you said no. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. You didn't have to do that. I know. She turned back to the stove. Supper's in 20 minutes. She could feel him standing in the kitchen doorway, looking at her back. Clara, he said. It was the first time he'd used her given name. She turned around. He looked like he was going to say several things and had decided against all of them. What he said finally was, "Thank you." She nodded once and turned back to the stove and heard him go to wash up for supper. The beans were going to be good tonight. She'd put in extra sage. The note Clara had added to the tin box on September 12th turned out to be the first in a series. She kept them factual and dated, the way she'd learned from watching her father's property dispute eat 6 years of his life in Ohio. Aldane's man rode the eastern fence line, September 19th, midday. Did not stop, did not speak to anyone. Left the way he came. And then, Dupree reports finding the south pasture gate unlatched 2 mornings running. Gate was secured each evening, September 23rd and 24th. She didn't know if any of it would matter. She knew that documentation was the only thing that ever mattered when the person across from you had more money and was prepared to use it. Cole read the notes without comment and put them back in the box. But he started coming in from the fields a little earlier in the evenings, and she noticed that he'd taken to checking the gate himself before he went to bed. October came in cold and fast. The creek recovered some of its level with the autumn rains, which was good for the ranch and, Clara suspected, bad for Aldane's argument that the water rights were critical enough to justify taking. A higher creek meant more water for everyone and less urgency in the dispute. She wrote that observation down too, not in the tin box, but in her own journal, which she kept not because she'd always been a journaling sort of woman, but because she'd found, in the months since Cincinnati, that she needed somewhere to put things that couldn't be said aloud. The boys were doing well enough that she'd stopped measuring them in terms of what they weren't and started seeing them more clearly as what they were. Noah was a natural scientist in the making. She was convinced of it now, with the specific kind of mind that collects information not to hold it, but to see what it connects to. His beetle drawings had expanded into a broader catalog of valley life. The hawk that nested on the north ridge, the way the creek changed color before rain, the tracks of 3 different species of deer in the mud near the water. He didn't narrate these things in words, but in careful images and notes, and Clara had started treating his observation journal as a legitimate part of his schooling because it was, she'd decided, more advanced than anything else he was doing. Levi was different in progress, but equivalent in depth. He had stopped crumpling his arithmetic papers and had, somewhere in late September, achieved a kind of provisional trust in the process of being wrong. Not comfort, exactly, but tolerance. He would cross out a mistake now with the air of someone acknowledging a minor inconvenience rather than a personal failure. Clara considered this significant. She suspected Levi was going to turn out to be the kind of person who built things, structures, arguments, systems, with a precision that most people didn't have patience for. The frontier would need people like that, and she told him so once, plainly, and he'd looked at her with the expression he used when he didn't know whether to believe something but was considering it. The fire started on a Wednesday. It was the third week of October, just past 2 in the morning, and Clara came awake in the bunkhouse to a smell rather than a sound. Smoke, thick and wrong, in a way that pulled her up from sleep before she'd consciously registered it. She was at the window in the same motion as waking, and what she saw through the warped glass made her stomach drop straight through the floor. The barn was lit from the inside, not a soft light, not a lantern left burning, which had been her first, reaching for rational thought. The wrong kind of light, orange and moving, throwing shadows through the cracks in the wall boards in a way that meant the inside was already well gone. She was out the door and across the yard before she'd put her boots on properly, one still unlaced, and she was screaming Cole's name at the house before she'd thought to do it. "Fire, Cole! Fire in the barn!" She hit the barn door at a run and got it open, and the heat that came out was a wall. Physical, wrong. The kind of heat that a body understands as danger before the brain has processed it. She could see the horses, 3 of them in the near stalls, all of them screaming in that high, flat register that horses make when they're terrified, all of them slamming against their stall doors. The fire was in the loft, had already taken the east wall, and was eating its way down the support post toward the stalls with a speed that left no room for anything but immediate action. She went in. She wasn't thinking about whether she should. She was thinking about the latches on the stall doors. Cole had built them solid. They didn't slide easy. You had to lift and pull at the same time. And she was thinking about which horse was closest and whether she could get to the far stall before the post nearest it came down. She got the first latch up, and the door opened and the mare came out at a dead run, nearly knocking her sideways. And she steadied against the stall wall and coughed and went for the second one. She heard Cole hit the barn behind her, heard him shout something that she couldn't make out through the noise of the fire, which was not the roar of storybooks, but a sound like continuous tearing, like something being taken apart very fast. She got the second latch open, shoved the door, got the gelding out, and was moving to the third stall when something above her let go. Not the whole loft, just a section of it. A beam, and whatever it was carrying, coming down at the back end of the aisle, which was nowhere near her but close enough that the impact sent a pulse of heat and displaced air that knocked her into the stall wall hard enough to see white for a moment. She stood up. Her hand was burned. Not badly, she'd catch it properly later, and her eyes were streaming from the smoke. She found the third stall by feel and got the latch open, and the horse was already shoving against the door, doing half the work, and she got clear as it came through. Cole materialized out of the smoke beside her and grabbed her arm, and she realized he was pulling her toward the door, and she went, because the barn was fully going now, and there was nothing left inside worth dying for. They came out into the night air coughing, and she bent double and her lungs tried to remember their function, and Cole had his hands on her shoulders, not holding her up exactly, but there, present, solid. "Are you hurt?" he said. "My hand." She showed him. He looked at it in the firelight, a burn across 2 fingers, not deep but real, and his face did something she didn't have the capacity to read right then. "The boys," she said. "They're out." He looked back at the barn. "Dupree has them." She straightened and looked. Noah and Levi were standing at the far end of the yard with old Dupree's arms around both of them, faces lit orange by the fire, watching the barn burn with the particular stillness of children who have seen fire destroy something before and know what it means. Clara stood up properly, got her breath mostly sorted, and looked at Cole. He was watching the barn with an expression that she recognized, not because she'd seen it on his face specifically, but because she'd seen it before in her life on people who were doing rapid, terrible arithmetic, adding up losses, measuring what was gone against what was left, coming up with a number that didn't have a name yet. "The horses are out," she said. "Yes." "The house is fine. The bunkhouse is fine." "Yes." He wasn't arguing with her. He was somewhere else in his head. "Cole." She said his name the way he'd said hers that evening in the kitchen. Not a question, not a request, just a marker. "I'm here. Come back." He looked at her. "We can rebuild a barn," she said. His jaw worked. "Third time," he said. "Third time something's burned on this property." She didn't have an answer for that. She stood beside him and watched the barn go and said nothing, because there wasn't anything to say that would make the arithmetic come out differently, and she'd learned enough about this man to know that false comfort was worse than silence. Dupree appeared at Cole's elbow after a few minutes with a blanket, which Cole didn't put on. Clara took it and put it around her own shoulders because she was shaking and hadn't noticed until that moment. "Started in the loft," Dupree said. His voice was flat in the way of someone filing a report. "East corner. That corner was clear yesterday evening when I checked it. Lamp was out. No hay piled near the wall." Cole looked at him. "Wasn't no accident," Dupree said. The three of them stood in the yard and watched the barn continue to burn, and nobody said anything else about it, because they didn't need to. By morning, the barn was a foundation and ash, which was a thing Clara had seen before on this property in a different context, and the understanding of that made her feel something she couldn't name that sat between fury and sorrow. Cole rode to town before the sun was properly up. He came back in the afternoon looking like a man who'd had a door closed in his face and was deciding whether to knock again or take it off its hinges. He sat down at the kitchen table and said flatly, "Sheriff's taken a statement. He'll investigate." "But," Clara said, But, Aldane's got two men who'll say his foreman was in town playing cards all night, and the sheriff's got no particular interest in pushing against a man who owns half the businesses on his street." Clara poured him coffee. He drank it. "I need to talk to you about something," he said. He set the cup down. "Aldane filed with the territorial court this morning. I found out when I was in town." She sat down. "The water rights. That's part of it." He looked at the table. "The other part—" He stopped, started again. "He's filed a petition claiming the boys are being raised in an unstable home environment. Unsafe. He's got a man he's put forward as a possible guardian, a cousin of his in Billings who's never set foot in this valley. He's going to try to take custody of Noah and Levi as part of the legal action." The kitchen went very quiet. Clara looked at him. He was looking at the table with the expression of a man who has already run every scenario and come out the other side. "He can do that?" she said. "He can try. He's got a lawyer in Helena who knows the territorial judges. A man alone out here, barn burned down, no wife, no permanent household staff. It'll look like what he wants it to look like on paper. It's not what it is. I know that." A pause. "But knowing it and proving it to a judge in Helena who's never been out here are two different things." Clara sat with that for a moment. She thought about Noah cataloging beetles in his mother's burned foundation. She thought about Levi crossing out a wrong answer instead of crumpling the page. She thought about two boys in the yard last night with Dupree's arms around them, watching fire eat another piece of their world. "What are the options?" she said. Cole looked up from the table. "I'm working on that." "Tell me what they are." "All of them." He was quiet for a long moment. "The lawyer in Billings, man named Sutherland, who did my deed work, says the strongest counter to the custody argument is a stable two-parent household. Courts don't like to remove children from a home with two parents present unless there's genuine cause. And Aldane's argument is specifically that there's no female presence here, no proper domestic structure." Clara heard what he was not saying. She sat very still and waited for him to say it. "I'm not going to ask you to do something you haven't agreed to," Cole said. "I want to be clear about that. This is a legal arrangement to stop a legal attack. Nothing else unless things change, which I can't predict and won't claim to." He met her eyes. "A marriage of record, registered in Harlan Creek. Sutherland says if we file inside of 10 days, before Aldane's court date, the custody argument collapses." Clara looked at him for a long time. He looked back. Neither of them was performing anything. There was no romanticism in the room, no softness, no pretense about what was being discussed. A man who had lost his wife and his barn in the same week was asking a woman who had arrived in this valley with $11 and no prospects to marry him to keep two children in the only home they had. "You need an answer now?" she said. "No. I need it inside of 3 days." She nodded. "All right." She stood up and went to check on the boys, who were in the main room supposedly doing their reading, but actually, she discovered, building something elaborate out of firewood pieces and a piece of rope they'd gotten from somewhere. She stood in the doorway and looked at them, and neither of them looked up. "The horses are all right," Levi said, without looking up from the construction project. "I checked." "Good," she said. "Is Papa going to fix the barn?" Noah asked. "Yes," she said, with more certainty than she had any right to. "He's going to fix the barn." She went back to the kitchen and sat down with her journal and wrote for a long time, and then closed it and looked out the window at the burned foundation where the barn had been. She thought about $11 and a broken window latch. She thought about a man who had stepped between her and danger because it needed doing, not because he wanted to. She thought about Cole sitting on the floor of the passage on the anniversary of his wife's death, and the way he'd said her name, May, like a thing he carried very carefully so it wouldn't break. She thought about what it meant to make a choice in the absence of good options, which was really just the definition of most decisions that mattered. She made a list in her journal, not the choice itself, but the reasons. She'd learned from her father's property dispute that the reasons mattered more than the decision, because they were what you went back to when things got difficult, and things always got difficult. The list had 6 items. When she was done, she read it twice and closed the journal. She told Cole her answer the following morning at breakfast, before the boys were down, while he was standing at the stove with his back to her, and she said it the way she said everything that mattered, plainly, without performance, looking at his back. "I'll marry you," she said. "Under the conditions you described, legal arrangement, nothing beyond that unless we both decide otherwise. And I keep my role with the boys. 3 things I need from you. You continue to be honest with me about the legal situation as it develops. You give me authority to make household decisions without coming back to you for every small thing. And you don't ever use the marriage as a reason to stop listening to me." Cole turned around. He looked at her for a moment. "Those are reasonable conditions," he said. "I know they are." "Then yes." He paused. "All 3. She nodded. "I'll need a new dress. Mine are inadequate." He almost smiled. "I'll get you the money." "Thank you." She turned to start the oatmeal, and behind her she heard him let out a breath that he'd probably been holding since yesterday afternoon, and that was all the ceremony there was. They rode to Harlan Creek 4 days later. Dupree stayed with the boys. The ride-in was mostly quiet, which was how they both seemed to prefer significant things, not filling them with noise. Clara wore the best of her 3 dresses, which was the dark blue one she'd brought from Cincinnati and worn exactly once, for the journey west. She'd done her hair more carefully than usual, and she was aware of herself doing it, and felt, about this, a complex mixture of practicality and something she didn't have a word for. Cole wore a clean shirt and his better coat, and he'd shaved, which she noticed without comment. Harlan Creek received the news of their arrival with the speed that small towns received any information, which was to say instantly and comprehensively. She felt eyes on them from the moment they tied the horses in front of the land office, and by the time they'd walked to the courthouse to file the paperwork, she could feel the town's attention on her back like a physical thing. She'd stood in this town 2.5 months ago with $11 and no prospects, and a telegram that had taken away the only plan she'd had. She walked through it now on the arm of a man who hadn't asked her opinion about most things when they'd first met, but had learned over the weeks since that her opinion tended to be worth having. The courthouse clerk, a nervous little man named Ames, who seemed to have a personal policy against eye contact, processed the paperwork with the jittery efficiency of someone who understood that things were happening above his pay grade and wanted to be done with his part in them as quickly as possible. Clara signed her name. Cole signed his. Ames witnessed, stamped, recorded, and filed, and in the space of 20 minutes, Clara Whitmore became Clara Mercer, which was a strange thing to be and would take some time to feel real. They came out of the courthouse into the afternoon light and stood on the steps, and neither of them said anything for a moment. "That's done," Cole said. "Yes." She looked at the main street, at the saloon where Pete had blocked the door and where Cole had opened it, at the hotel where she'd spent one night with a chair wedged under the door handle. "Is the lawyer being notified today?" "I sent the telegram this morning." "Good." She straightened her gloves. "I could use coffee before we ride back. There's a decent place near the post office." They walked to the coffee shop and sat down across from each other at a small table near the window, and the woman who brought their coffee looked at Clara with frank curiosity and said, "Are you the woman who came out with Mercer?" "I am," Clara said. "I'm his wife." The woman looked at Cole and then back at Clara and then went away to get the coffee. And Cole looked at the window and Clara looked at her hands. And after a moment she started to laugh. Not because anything was funny, exactly, just because the whole improbable sequence of events that had led from Cincinnati to this coffee shop with this particular man was so thoroughly unlike anything she'd planned that laughing at it seemed like the only reasonable response. Cole looked at her. "What is it?" "Nothing," she said. "Everything." She got the laugh under control. "I came out here to marry a man I'd never met, on the word of a broker I barely trusted. And he canceled before I even got off the train. And now I've just married a different man I'd also never met. And I'm living on his ranch and teaching his children, and it's not what I expected my life to look like." "No," he said. "I don't suppose it is. Is it what you expected yours to look like?" He was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, the main street went about its business. "No," he said. "But less and less things are." The coffee came. They drank it. It was not particularly good coffee, but it was hot, which was enough. On the ride home, about halfway, with the valley spread out ahead of them, and the late afternoon light going sideways across the grass, Cole said, without preamble, "I don't know how to do this well. I want to say that plainly. I did it once, and I knew how then, or I thought I did, and now I'm less sure of everything." "I've never done it at all," Clara said, "so we're both working without a model." "That's not reassuring. It's not meant to be. It's meant to be accurate." He looked at her, and this time there was no ambiguity about it. Something in his face that was specifically for her, not the flat assessment of a man cataloging a situation, but the look of one person recognizing another. "Fair enough," he said. They rode the rest of the way in silence, but it was a different quality of silence than the one they'd ridden out in that morning. The papers reached Aldane's lawyer 3 days before the territorial court date. Sutherland sent a brief letter informing Cole that the custody petition had been withdrawn following the establishment of a two-parent household, and that the water rights dispute remained on the docket, but without the accompanying family action, which reduced it to a straightforward property matter, where Cole's documented evidence was considerably stronger. He recommended patience and preparedness, and sent a bill that made Clara wince when she saw it. "We'll manage it," Cole said. "I know, I'm just noting it." The boys took the news of the marriage with a quietness that Clara suspected was more processing than indifference. At breakfast the morning after they returned from town, Noah had looked at her across the oatmeal and said, "Does this mean you're not leaving?" "That's the idea," she said. He looked at his bowl. "Okay," he said, which was, from Noah, approximately equivalent to a speech. Levi said nothing about it for 4 days, and then, on the 5th day, while they were working on a long grammar exercise, he looked up and said, "Can we get a dog?" Clara looked at him. "That's a question for your father. He said to ask you." She almost laughed. "What kind of dog?" "A useful one," Levi said. "Not a fancy one." "We'll see," she said, which she realized when Levi smiled, not the almost smile, not the quarter smile, but an actual smile with teeth in it, was apparently close enough to yes. The violence came in November, and it came not as a slow escalation, but all at once, the way serious violence tends to come when it's been decided at a deliberate level by someone with resources. Clara heard the horses first. She was in the kitchen. Cole was outside checking the temporary structure they'd built to shelter the horses while the barn reconstruction was in progress, and the boys were upstairs with their evening reading. It was past dark, a clear, cold night with the first real frost of the season on the ground, and she'd been thinking about whether there was enough salt meat to last through January. 4 horses, maybe 5, coming fast from the direction of town. She went to the front window and looked out, and then went immediately to the bottom of the stairs and said, in a voice that was controlled but carried, "Noah, Levi, come down now. Bring your coats." She heard them move. She went to the door and opened it and shouted Cole's name once, hard, and heard him answer from the direction of the horse shelter. The riders were at the gate. There were 5 of them, and they weren't making any pretense about their errand, One of them already had a lit torch, which told her everything about what Aldane had decided, now that the legal strategy had failed, to try next. Cole came around the corner of the house at a run. He had the rifle, which told her he'd understood from her tone of voice what kind of situation this was. "Take the boys," he said, without stopping. "Get them to the root cellar." "Cole, Clara." He looked at her for 1 second. "Take the boys to the cellar." She took the boys to the cellar. She got them down the hatch behind the kitchen, got the lamp, and sat them against the far wall on the potato sacks, and put her arms around both of them and said, "Stay here," and meant it absolutely. "Is it the firemen?" Levi said. His voice was not a child's voice in that moment. It was the voice of someone who had rehearsed this fear so many times that it had worn down to something factual. "I don't know," Clara said. "Stay here." She heard shouting from outside. She heard one shot, then a pause, then what sounded like men arguing rather than shooting, which she took as possibly good news. Then she heard the crackle. She felt it before she heard it. The particular change in air quality, the smell. Something was burning. Not the house. The sound was wrong for the house, but something. Noah made a sound beside her and she tightened her arms. "Stay," she said. She counted. She did it because the boys needed to hear something regular and human, and she needed something to do with the part of her mind that was running calculations she couldn't control. She counted to 60, then to 60 again. Then the hatch above them opened and Cole's face appeared, lit from above, smoke-smudged and alive. "It's done," he said. "Come up." Yeah, they'd burned the half-rebuilt barn frame. 2 weeks of lumber and labor, gone. The main house was untouched. Cole had gotten the rifle out fast enough that the men hadn't pressed further, and one of them had apparently reconsidered the entire enterprise when a bullet went through his hat. Dupree, who had been in his bedroll in the old bunkhouse, had come out with his own shotgun and demonstrated the particular persuasiveness of an old man who no longer has much patience for nonsense. And the riders had retreated, but the barn frame was ash. Again. Clara stood in the yard with both boys against her sides and looked at the burning structure and felt something crystallize in her chest that was not fear and was not grief and was not anger exactly, was something colder and more useful than any of those. "All right," she said quietly, to nobody in particular. Cole came to stand beside her. He was looking at the fire with the expression she recognized from the first barn burning, and she understood that the arithmetic he was running now was the same one. What's left? What can be rebuilt? How long? And that the number he was arriving at this time had a different shape. "They're going to keep coming," he said. It wasn't despair. It was a statement of logistics. "Yes," she said. "Until we make it cost them more than they're gaining." He looked at her. "I've been thinking about this since September," she said, "since he came to the house and made that offer. He's been trying to force you out by making staying too expensive. We need to make him understand that removing us is more expensive than leaving us alone." "We don't have his money." "No," she said, "but I know things he doesn't think I know, and I know people he doesn't know I know." She thought about the letters she'd been writing quietly over the past months. To the Territorial Education Office, yes, but also to a woman in Billings who published a small newspaper and who had written about Aldane's treatment of another rancher 2 years ago. To a lawyer in Helena who had represented landholders in water rights cases and who had a professional antagonism toward Aldane's law firm that she'd discovered from Sutherland's correspondence. To the Territorial Land Commissioner's Office, which she'd learned from Cole's papers had an ongoing inquiry into survey practices in 3 counties, including this one. She had been documenting since September. She had been building something, quietly, while Aldane had been burning things. "What are you going to do?" Cole said. She looked at the burning barn frame and then at him. "I'm going to use what I have," she said, which is documentation and communication and the fact that he underestimated what I was paying attention to. Cole looked at her for a long moment. Behind them, Noah had his head against her arm, and Levi was watching the fire with that look he used when he was memorizing something. "Tell me what you need," Cole said. "Paper," she said, "and time." He nodded once. The matter settled the way he settled things, not with ceremony, but with decision. He put his hand briefly on her shoulder, and then he went to make sure Dupree was all right and the horses were secured, And Clara stood in the cold November night with her husband's children against her sides and planned. The barn could burn. The frame could burn. The family inside the fence was still standing, and that, she had decided, was the part that mattered. She wrote the first letter that same night. Cole had gotten the boys back to bed, not easily, and not without sitting with each of them longer than usual, which she heard through the ceiling as the particular rhythm of a father's voice doing what voices do when words aren't enough. She was at the kitchen table with the lamp turned up and the tin box open beside her, working through what she had and what she needed, when he came back downstairs. He looked at the papers spread across the table and didn't say anything. He put another log in the stove, poured himself what was left of the evening's coffee, and sat down across from her. "Tell me the plan," he said. She told him. It took about 20 minutes, and he listened the way he listened to everything, without interrupting, without steering, with the focused attention of a man who has learned that gathering information before forming an opinion is more useful than the alternative. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "The woman in Billings," he said. "The newspaper. Her name is Ruth Galvin. She wrote 2 pieces about Aldane's handling of the Ferris Ranch dispute in '81. She didn't get enough material to publish a 3rd one because the Ferris family settled and stopped talking. I've been corresponding with her since October." Cole looked at her. "I didn't mention your name," she said. "I wrote as a reader with information. She's been interested in what I've sent her." "What have you sent her?" "Survey discrepancies. Public record on the water rights filings. The timing of Aldane's legal actions in relation to rail company land purchases in the county." She paused. "I'm going to send her what happened tonight, with dates, with the number of riders and what they burned and what they didn't burn." Cole set his coffee down. He looked at the table for a moment and then at her. "You've been doing this since October." September, actually, when he came to the house and made the offer. He was quiet again. She had learned to read his silences with some accuracy by now. This one was not displeasure, but something more complicated, a man recalibrating the distance between what he'd assumed and what was actually true. "You didn't tell me," he said. "I didn't have anything concrete yet. I don't like to talk about things I'm not certain of." "I'm your husband." "I know that." She looked at him directly. "I'm telling you now because now there's something to tell. The correspondence with Galvin, the contact with the Helena lawyer, Haynes, his name is. He's handled 3 water rights cases against Aldane's firm and lost 2 of them, but not because of the facts. And the inquiry I filed with the Territorial Land Commissioner's office about the survey methodology. None of it was actionable before tonight. Tonight changes the math." Cole looked at the stack of letters, the dated notes, the organized correspondence going back 3 months. "You built a case," he said. "I started one. Tonight gives it weight." He picked up the letter to Galvin she'd already begun and read it. She watched him read. He read slowly and carefully, and when he finished, he set it down. "Add that one of the rider's horses had a Circle A brand on its left hip," he said. "I saw it when they came through the gate. Circle A is Aldane's Remuda mark." Clara picked up her pen. "Are you certain?" "I've seen that brand on his horses in town." "I'm certain." She added the detail, wrote it in, dated, and initialed it the way her father's lawyer had taught her to initial amendments. "That's significant," she said. "I know it is." They worked at the table until nearly 3 in the morning. By the time Clara put her pen down, her hand was cramping and the lamp was low, and there were 4 completed letters, a revised summary of documented incidents going back to September, and a formal complaint to the Territorial Sheriff's Office. Not the local sheriff, who was useless, but the Territorial Office in Helena, which operated independently of Aldane's business interests. Cole looked at the pile. "When does it go out?" "First mail to Billings is Thursday. I'd like to ride to town tomorrow and send the Helena letter by telegraph if you can spare the money for it." "I can spare it." "And I want to post copies of the documented incident summary at the general store and the post office in town before we send anything to Helena. If people here know what we're filing before Aldane can respond to it, he can't quietly make it go away." Cole looked at her with the expression she'd first seen on the boardwalk in Harlan Creek. That flat, precise assessment. Except now she knew what was under it, and it was different. "You understand this is going to make him angrier before it makes him stop," he said. "Yes," she said. "That's why we need to move fast. We post in town, we send to Helena, we send to Galvin, all of it inside of 48 hours. If we're slow, he has time to respond and contain it. If we're fast, he's responding instead of acting. Cole nodded once. One more thing, she said. I'd like to speak to some of the ranchers on the North Road. The ones Dupree mentioned, the Holt family and the Breck brothers. Aldane's been buying up land along that corridor for 2 years. If any of them have had similar pressure and are willing to say so on record, it changes the picture from one rancher with a grievance to a pattern. Cole was quiet for a moment. Ed Holt won't talk. He settled with Aldane last spring and he's not going to revisit it. But his brother-in-law Cass Breck hasn't settled and he's been fighting the survey question for 8 months. He paused. I'll ride to Breck tomorrow. She looked at him. You don't have to. You're doing the writing. I can do the writing. He said it with a flatness that was not dismissal but practicality, the way they'd fallen into dividing things since the marriage. Not formally, not with discussion, but by recognition of what each of them was able to do. She gathered the papers into order and put them in the tin box and closed it. She put the tin box on the shelf above the desk where it had always sat, and stood up, and the exhaustion of the night hit her all at once. The barn, the smoke, the cellar with the boys, the hours of writing. Go to bed, Cole said. He said it the way he said most things. Not unkind, not warm, just accurate. I'll check the yard. She went to bed. She lay on her side and looked at the dark of the bedroom. Her bedroom, now, which was still a strange fact, and thought about the case she'd been building since September and whether it was enough. Whether it would be enough. Whether she'd missed something. Whether Aldane had angles she hadn't mapped. She was not. She had learned about herself, a natural optimist. But she was a thorough one, and thoroughness, in her experience, was more reliable than optimism. She heard Cole come in. She heard him sit on the edge of the bed and pull his boots off, and she heard the specific tiredness in that sound. A man at the end of something that had cost him. Cole, she said. Yeah. We're going to be all right. A pause. You can't know that. No, but I've thought about it more carefully than most people think about most things. And that's where I come out. Silence. Get some sleep, he said. She did. Sat. The next 48 hours were the most organized Clara had ever been in her life, which was saying something because she was a systematically organized person by nature. She and Cole divided the work without friction. He rode north to the Breck property, while she drove the wagon to Harlan Creek with Dupree beside her and the tin box on her lap. She posted the incident summary at the general store herself, putting it on the public board between a notice for a missing bay horse and an advertisement for a land sale, where anyone coming in for supplies would see it. The storekeeper, a man named Garfield who had always been neutrally civil to her, read it over her shoulder and said nothing. But he didn't take it down. She posted a second copy at the post office and sent the Helena Telegraph and mailed the letters to Galvin and Haynes while she was there, and she was done and back in the wagon within the hour. Aldane found out about the posting by mid-afternoon. She knew this because she was still in town sorting out a supply order when she saw his lawyer's clerk walk briskly out of the land office and toward the saloon, where Aldane was known to conduct afternoon business, carrying a piece of paper that looked very much like the summary she'd posted. She watched the clerk go, and then she went back to the supply order because there was nothing else to do and everything had been done that could be done. Cole was back by evening with news. Cass Breck had agreed to provide a written statement describing 18 months of pressure from Aldane's surveyors and agents regarding his eastern fence line. He'd been reluctant until Cole had described the previous night's riders, at which point he'd become, according to Cole, significantly less reluctant. He's got documentation too, Cole said. Not as organized as yours, but dates, names, what was said. Send him to me, Claire said. I'll help him organize it. Cole looked at her. You're going to reorganize a stranger's legal files. I'm going to make sure his statement is coherent enough to be useful, yes. She paused. Do you object? No? He almost smiled. I'm just noting it. Aldane's response came not through legal channels, but through direct confrontation, which told Clara that the posting had rattled him more than a formal reply would have indicated. He came to the ranch in person, this time with his lawyer, a man named Corrigan, who had the smooth, expensive manner of someone paid specifically to make threats sound like reasonable proposals, and 2 riders who hung back at the gate. Clara answered the door. Mrs. Mercer, Aldane said. He said the name with a particular emphasis, like he was tasting something he hadn't expected to find there. I'd like to speak with your husband. He's in the field. I can speak with you. Corrigan stepped forward. This is a legal matter that requires Mr. Mercer directly. My husband and I share authority in all matters pertaining to this property, Clara said. What you say to me has the same weight as what you say to him. Please go ahead. Corrigan looked at Aldane. Aldane looked at Clara. You've filed complaints that contain material misrepresentations, Corrigan said. The incident you've described does not reflect— Which incident specifically? Clara said. The October 9th fence gate incidents which Dupree witnessed? The September 12th visit from Mr. Aldane, which I documented the same day? Or the November fire, in which one of Mr. Aldane's horses, Circle A brand, left hip, was observed among the riders by my husband, who is prepared to swear to that in a territorial court? Corrigan stopped. Aldane's expression did something that was not quite controlled. I have copies of every document I've filed, Clara continued, in 3 separate locations with 3 separate people, none of whom are in Harlan Creek. If anything happens to the originals or to this family, those copies go directly to the Territorial Attorney General's office and to 2 newspapers, one in Billings and one in Helena. That's already been arranged. She paused. Was there something specific you wanted to address? The silence on the porch was its own kind of answer. You're making a serious mistake, Aldane said. His voice was different now. The pleasantness was gone, and what was underneath it was not as impressive as he thought it was. It was just anger, plain and ordinary. I've made notes of this visit as well, Clara said. Date, time, names. Mr. Corrigan, you're welcome to provide your bar number for the record if you'd like. Corrigan did not provide his bar number. They left. Clara went inside and sat down at the kitchen table and put her hands flat on the surface and breathed until they stopped shaking. Because they were shaking. That was the thing nobody saw. The shaking after, when the steadiness had done its job and the body finally caught up to what the brain had been managing. She gave herself 5 minutes. Then she wrote down the visit, time-stamped it, and put it in the box. Pishab. The response from Helena came faster than she'd expected. 12 days after she'd sent the telegraph and the formal complaint, a letter arrived from the Territorial Land Commissioner's office acknowledging receipt and informing Cole Mercer that a review of survey practices in the relevant county had been initiated and that his documentation had been incorporated into a broader inquiry already underway. The letter was signed by a deputy commissioner and was, in its bureaucratic way, significant. It meant Aldane was now the subject of a territorial inquiry rather than just a private complaint. She read it twice and then left it on the kitchen table where Cole would find it when he came in. He read it standing up, still in his coat, with the look of a man who has been bracing for impact for so long that the absence of it is almost disorienting. It's not over, she said. The inquiry takes months. The water rights case is still on the docket. I know. He set the letter down. But it's different now. Yes, she said. It is. Galvin's piece ran in the Billings paper 3 weeks later. Clara read it at the kitchen table with Cole sitting across from her, and it was not what she'd expected in terms of scale. It was not a small piece. Galvin had done her own reporting, had found 2 other families in 2 other counties with similar patterns of pressure from Aldane's land operation, and had written something that was considerably larger than one rancher's water rights dispute. The Mercer situation was part of it, named but not centered, which was exactly right. The piece named Aldane specifically and described the rail company's land acquisition strategy in terms that made it a matter of regional interest rather than local grievance. It included the documented incident from November with the Circle A horses. She's good, Cole said when he finished reading. Yes, she is. You told her about the horses. I told her what you observed, with your initials on the note. He looked at the paper. Aldane's going to know where this came from. He's known since I posted in town. The question was never whether he'd know. It was whether the cost of continuing was going to outweigh the benefit. Cole looked at her. Is it? Haynes thinks so. He wrote last week, the inquiry from Helena is connected to something larger that the Territorial Attorney General's office has been building for a year. We're not the center of it. We're evidence in it. She paused. Aldane's lawyers are going to tell him to settle and go quiet. That's my guess. A man with political ambitions, and he has them, that's in Galvin's piece. He wants a territorial council seat. Can't afford this kind of attention. 3 days after that, Sutherland received a communication from Corrigan's office proposing a resolution to the water rights case. Aldane would drop all claims to the creek boundary in exchange for a public withdrawal of the complaint to the territorial sheriff's office. Terms to be negotiated. Clara read the proposal and wrote back, through Sutherland, that the public complaint to the territorial sheriff was a matter of record and could not be unilaterally withdrawn, as it was now part of the broader inquiry, but that the Mercers were prepared to refrain from filing additional complaints, provided Aldane's firm ceased all activity affecting Mercer Flat property, confirmed in writing. It was not everything. It was not a clean win. The inquiry would continue for another year regardless, and the water rights case would need a formal resolution at the court date. But it was enough to establish that the pressure had stopped and the boundary was not in immediate danger, and enough to make clear that the family had not been moved. Corrigan wrote back. His client accepted the terms. The afternoon it was settled, really settled, documents signed and filed. Clara drove the wagon to Harlan Creek. She had an errand at the general store, which was legitimate, and she had something else she needed to do, which was less a practical task and more something she felt was necessary in a way she hadn't examined too carefully. She went into Garfield's store and got what she needed and was loading it into the wagon when she saw Pete, the man from the saloon on her first day in town, coming out of the hardware store across the street. He saw her at the same moment. He looked different in November than he had in June, a little more worn, a little less certain of himself, which was possibly the cold, or possibly the fact that the thing he'd been adjacent to had just collapsed in a fairly public way. He stood on the boardwalk and looked at her across the mud of the street. She looked back at him without expression for a moment. Then she finished loading the wagon, climbed up, and drove down the main street. She pulled up in front of the saloon. She got down from the wagon and went inside. It was mid-afternoon, and the place was half empty. 3 men at the bar, 2 at tables, the same bartender who'd looked at his glass when she'd needed help 6 months ago. He looked at her now with an expression that mixed discomfort and something approaching chagrin. She walked to the bar. The room had gone quiet the way it goes quiet when something unexpected happens. She put both hands on the bar. She looked at the bartender. "Last June," she said, "I came in here looking for work. Some of your customers made that difficult. You looked the other way." The bartender said nothing. "I want you to know that I understand why you did that," she said. "I understand that Aldane had money in this room, metaphorically speaking, and that a woman who'd just come off the train with no connections wasn't worth the trouble of defending. I understand that." She paused. "I'm not here to have a fight about it. I'm here because I think it's worth saying out loud, in this particular room, that it's possible to be in a place, in a situation, and choose to do nothing, and that choosing to do nothing is its own kind of choice." Must eat. She looked around the room. The men at the tables were watching her. One of them was Pete. "Victor Aldane is going to be quiet for a while, Sam," she said. "Possibly longer. He's got an Attorney General's inquiry on his surveys and a Territorial Land Commissioner's review and a Billings newspaper that's interested in his rail company's practices. I didn't do that alone. My husband gave me what he knew, and Cass Breck gave a statement, and a good lawyer in Helena helped put it in the right language. But I want to be clear about what happened. A man with money and connections tried to take a family's land and their children, and he underestimated what a woman with a pen and some patience could do about it. She picked up her hands from the bar. "That's all I wanted to say," she said. "Thank you for your time." She walked out. She climbed back up on the wagon and sat there for a moment in the cold afternoon air, looking at the street. Her heart was doing the thing it did. The delayed hammering, the body catching up. She let it hammer. Then she heard a sound behind her and turned. The bartender had come to the door of the saloon. He stood in the doorway and looked at her across the boardwalk, and he said gruffly, without quite meeting her eyes, "You want a coffee before you ride back?" She considered him for a moment. "Yes," she said. "Thank you." She tied the horses and went back inside, and the bartender poured her a cup without ceremony, and she sat at the bar and drank it while the room did its business around her, and nobody said anything in particular, and nobody needed to. The barn went up in February. Not quickly. Lumber was expensive in winter and the weather fought them for every day of work. But it went up, solid and square, in the same spot the old one had occupied. Cole did most of the framing himself, with Dupree and Cass Breck and 2 of Breck's men who came over for 3 weekends to help. Clara kept everyone fed, which was its own full-time project in February, and Noah and Levi ran lumber and held things when asked, and got in the way in the specific productive manner of boys who are learning what things are made of. On the last day of framing, when the main structure was up, and the crew had gone home and the sun was going down behind the western ridge, Clara stood in the yard and looked at it. Cole came to stand beside her, smelling like sawdust and cold air, and the particular worn-out satisfaction of physical work finished. "It's bigger than the last one," she said. "A little. Dupree said if I was rebuilding, I should build what I needed, not what I had." She looked at it for a moment. May was right about that, about building bigger than what you need. He was quiet. She felt him look at her. "You know about that?" he said. "Levi told me, months ago." She kept her eyes on the barn. "I didn't mention it because it seemed like his to tell." Cole was quiet for a moment longer. "She would have said the same thing you did," he said, "in the saloon. She would have walked back in there and said exactly that." Clara thought about a woman who had argued about window angles for 3 days because she knew exactly how she wanted the light to come in. "I think I believe that," she said. They stood there until the light went fully, and neither of them filled it with words, and that was its own kind of language. The water rights case resolved in April. The territorial court, with the land commissioner's inquiry now formally attached to the record, found in Cole's favor on the creek boundary. The original survey was upheld, Aldane's counter-survey was rejected, and the creek remained entirely within Mercer Flats' boundary. Sutherland's bill for the proceedings was eye-watering, but manageable. Barely. Haynes wrote from Helena to say the broader inquiry was progressing and that Aldane's attorneys had been cooperating, which was legal language for he's trying to minimize the damage, which was fine. Clara wrote back and thanked him and filed his letter in the tin box, which was getting full. That evening at supper, when Cole told the boys the court had ruled in their favor, both of them received the information with the particular calm of children who have been braced for a long time and haven't yet adjusted to the bracing no longer being necessary. Then Levi said, "Can we get the dog now?" Cole looked at Clara. Clara looked at Cole. "A useful one," she said. "Not a fancy one." Cole almost laughed. It was the closest thing to laughing she'd heard from him, a sound that was short and genuine and surprised itself. "I'll ask around," he said. Noah, who had been eating quietly through all of this, set his fork down and looked at Clara with his father's November River eyes. "Miss Clara," he said, and then stopped. "What is it?" He thought for a moment, assembling whatever he wanted to say with the care he applied to the things that mattered. "You didn't leave," he said, "when it would have been easier." She looked at him. "No," she said. "I didn't." "Why?" She thought about it honestly, because he deserved an honest answer, and he would know if she gave him a comfortable one instead. "Because this is where I am," she said, "and being somewhere means being in it all the way, not just when it's easy." She paused. "Also, I had nowhere better to be." Noah looked at her for a moment, then he nodded once, in the way his father nodded when something was settled, and picked his fork back up. Levi, without looking up from his plate, said, "I knew you weren't going to leave." "Did you?" "From the beginning. You had the wrong kind of shoes for someone who was planning to leave." Clara looked at her shoes. They were, she had to admit, very practical shoes. "You're not wrong," she said. Cole looked at his plate and said nothing, but something in the set of his shoulders was different than it had been in June or September or November or any of the months between. Lighter, maybe. Not light. He was not a light man and probably never would be, but lighter. Outside the window, the April light was doing what April light does in Montana, stretching long and gold across the valley, filling up the space between the things that had been lost and the things that remained, which was maybe the best that light could do, but was not nothing. Clara ate her supper and listened to the boys argue about what to name a dog they didn't have yet, and Cole put in one suggestion and was immediately overruled by both of them, and the kitchen was warm and the stove was working, and it was enough. More than enough, actually. Though she had learned not to say that kind of thing aloud because the frontier had a way of hearing optimism and deciding to test it. She kept that thought to herself and passed the bread and called it a good day. The dog arrived in May. He was not, by any objective measure, an impressive animal. Cass Breck had found him at the trading post in the company of a trapper who'd been trying to sell him for 2 weeks without success, which told its own story. He was medium-sized, the color of old mud, with one ear that stood up and one that didn't, and the particular expression of a dog who has been disappointed by people before and is reserving judgment on whether the current arrangement will be different. Levi named him Scout within the first 10 minutes, without deliberation, with the certainty of a child who knows what something is before he's been told. Noah accepted this without argument, which was itself notable. Scout regarded the family for approximately 3 days with professional skepticism, and then attached himself to Levi with the complete, unambiguous devotion of an animal who has decided and will not be reconsidering. He slept at the foot of Levi's cot, followed him to lessons on the porch, and sat outside the barn during chores with the patient, attentiveness of someone waiting for a meeting to end. Cole watched this development with the quiet satisfaction of a man whose household had added something that cost very little and was clearly worth considerably more. He didn't say much about it. He didn't need to. Clara noticed the way he looked at Levi and the dog in the evening light, and she understood that some things resolved themselves in ways that no amount of deliberate effort could have engineered. That was one of the things she was still learning about this life. The difference between the problems you could plan your way out of and the ones that required you to simply stay present until something shifted on its own. Summer came in full and honest that year, without the brutal edge the previous one had carried. The new barn was everything the old one hadn't been: better ventilated, better sighted relative to the prevailing wind, with a tack room that was twice the size of the previous one because Dupree had insisted on it and Clara had backed him. The creek was running well. The hay came in strong. The south pasture pump that had been failing since before Clara arrived finally failed completely in June, and Cole replaced it in 3 days with help from Noah, who turned out to have an instinctive mechanical comprehension that neither parent had anticipated, and both recognized as something worth developing. Clara watched this discovery with the specific satisfaction of a teacher who has been paying attention long enough to see something emerge that she didn't plant, only noticed. Noah at 10 was becoming someone, not a finished someone, not even close, but the shape of a person with a particular kind of mind was clarifying. He still kept his observation journal, still cataloged things with systematic patience, but he'd started asking questions about how machines worked, about what made a pump fail, about the engineering of the water system Cole had built for the livestock. He read anything Clara could get her hands on that was relevant, and she had started ordering more specifically on his behalf, which required justifying the expenditure to Cole, which she did once and never had to do again. Levi, for his part, had become the most reliable person on the property for any task that required precision and follow-through. He was 10 years old and could keep accounts with an accuracy that made Dupree, who had been doing the ranch books by approximation for years, quietly embarrassed. Clara had started teaching him double-entry bookkeeping from a text she'd ordered from a Denver supplier, and he received this information with the focused seriousness of someone who has found the language that matches the way they already think. She told Cole about it one evening in the way she'd gotten into the habit of reporting the boys' progress. Not formally, not as a teacher delivering grades, but as someone who lived with them and saw things. "He's going to be good with money," she said, "not just keeping it, understanding what it means strategically." Cole looked at her. "He's 10. I know how old he is. I'm telling you what I see." She paused. "Noah's going to want to build things. Engines, maybe? Or irrigation systems, or something we don't have a word for yet. Levi's going to want to understand how systems work and make them more efficient." She set down her coffee. "They need more than I can give them eventually. In a few years, they're going to need schooling I can't provide out here." Cole was quiet for a moment. "You're talking about sending them away." "I'm talking about planning for it. There's a difference." She looked at him. "You have time, but not unlimited time." He didn't answer right away, which was how she knew he was taking it seriously. He thought about things before he responded, always, and the things he was slow to answer were the things that mattered. "All right," he said finally. "We plan for it." She nodded. "Good." They sat with the evening coming in through the kitchen window, and she thought that this was the thing nobody told you about building a life with someone. Not the dramatic moments, not the fires, or the legal fights, or the impossible choices, but this. Two people at a kitchen table in the long light, talking about the future of children they both loved, in a house that had survived everything thrown at it. That was the substance of it. That was what it actually was. It was Clara's idea to start the school. She had been turning it over since winter, quietly, in the way she turned over things that were large enough to require time before speaking. The territory had programs for frontier schoolhouses. She knew this, had used the same channels to get Noah and Levi's books. What the valley didn't have was a building or an organized effort or anyone willing to do the administrative work of pulling it together. She raised it with Cole in August, after the hay was in, and the pressure of the immediate season had lifted enough that a larger conversation was possible. "There are 14 children within riding distance of this property," she said. "I've counted. The Breck children, the 2 Garner families on the North Road, the settlement family that came in last spring past the Eastern Ridge, the Holt grandchildren who are living out there now. None of them have regular schooling. Some of them have none." Cole looked at her across the table with the expression of a man who can already see where something is going and is deciding how he feels about it. "The old bunkhouse," she said. "It's solid. It's empty since you rebuilt the other one last year, and it's large enough for 15 children if we put in proper benches. The territory will provide books and a small stipend if the school is registered. I've already written to the education office to ask about the process." "You've already written," he said. "Not a question. I wrote 2 weeks ago. I wanted to know if it was feasible before I brought it to you." He was quiet for a moment. "You'd teach." "To start. The idea is to get it established enough that a permanent teacher can be funded." She paused. "Though I'd likely keep teaching until that happens, which could be a few years. It's a lot of work on top of what you're already doing. I'm aware of that." "Clara." He said her name in the way that meant he wanted her to actually hear the next part. "I'm not asking you not to do it. I'm asking if you've accounted for what it costs you." She looked at him. He looked back. This was, she had come to understand, one of the ways he showed care, not by telling her what to do or not do, but by asking whether she'd thought about herself in the equation. He'd always done it, and she'd always noticed it, and she'd never said so directly, which was a thing they did. Notice things about each other and carry them without announcement. "I've accounted for it," she said. "All right." He nodded. "What do you need from me?" "Help getting the bunkhouse ready. And I'd like to pay Dupree a little more while I'm occupied with the school setup because he's going to be carrying more of the household work, and he should be compensated." "Done." He looked at the table for a moment. "You know the Garner family is going to wonder about sending their children here. They don't know us well. I'll ride over and introduce myself properly." "And the Holts?" "Ed Holt's wife was at the general store last month. We spoke. She's been looking for exactly this." She paused. "People want it. They just need someone to build it." Cole looked at her with the expression she had never quite been able to name and had stopped trying to because some things were better understood than named. "You've been building things since June," he said quietly. "This whole time." "I've been building this since about February," she said. "I just needed the hay in first." He made the sound that was as close to laughing as he usually got, and she took it for what it was, and they got to work. Quote, "The Mercer Flat Schoolhouse opened on a Monday in September, 1 year, almost to the week, from the day Aldane had ridden up to the gate with his lawyer to make his offer. 11 children arrived on that first morning, ranging in age from 6 to 13, brought by parents who had driven wagons and ridden horses from across the valley. Clara had the bunkhouse cleaned and benched and stocked with the books the territory had sent, and she'd made a proper chalkboard from a piece of planking painted with a mixture Cole had found in a carpentry guide, and it worked reasonably well if you didn't look at it too closely. She stood at the front of the room and looked at 11 faces looking back at her, and she thought about a train platform in Cincinnati and a telegram and $11, and she thought that the distance between that moment and this one was not measurable in miles or months. "Good morning," she said. "My name is Mrs. Mercer, and this is your school." She saw, in the third row, one of the Garner children, a girl of about 8 with her hair in 2 uneven braids and the expression of someone not yet sure this was going to be worth the journey. And she thought, there, that one. That's why. She started teaching. The inquiry from the Territorial Attorney General's office concluded in October of that year. Aldane's survey firm was found to have filed materially inaccurate boundary reports in 7 separate cases across 3 counties. 2 members of the firm faced professional censure. Aldane himself was not charged criminally. He had enough lawyers to ensure that. But the political ambitions he'd been cultivating evaporated quickly in the aftermath. And the territorial council seat he'd wanted went to a rancher from the northern county instead. Sutherland sent a brief letter informing Cole that all claims related to Mercer Flat's water boundary were permanently resolved in their favor and that the case had been formally closed. Clara read the letter and put it in the tin box, which she then moved from under Cole's desk to the shelf in the main room where it would be easier to find. She wasn't sure why she moved it. It just felt like something that should be in the open now rather than hidden. Cole saw the box on the shelf that evening and didn't say anything about it, but the next day she noticed he'd put the letter from the land commissioner on top. Not inside the box, but on top, visible. Like a marker. Like a thing worth seeing. She didn't say anything about that either. They had a grammar of silences by now that communicated more than most people managed with full sentences. Cass Breck's daughter was one of the first students at the school. Her name was Molly, and she was 9, and she could already read better than 3 of the older children, which Clara identified in the first week and addressed by giving her more advanced material and a quiet instruction not to make it obvious. Molly received this guidance with the pragmatic social intelligence of a child who already understood more about how things worked than most adults gave her credit for. Clara liked her immediately. She reminded her, a little, of herself at that age, the specific quality of a girl who is paying more attention than the room knows. The school added 2 more students in November, when a family from further up the valley heard about it from the Holts and made the decision to make the longer journey. Clara reorganized the benches to accommodate them and wrote to the territorial office for additional materials and made a note in her planning book that if enrollment reached 15, she was going to need a second teacher. She wrote to Ruth Galvin in Billings about the school. Galvin wrote a small piece about it, much smaller than the Aldane piece, a human interest paragraph in the community section, that described it as the first organized frontier school in the valley. Clara read it and thought that organized was doing considerable work in that sentence, given the condition of the chalkboard. But people read it. A woman from Billings wrote to Clara directly, asking about enrollment procedures for her nephew's family who was considering a homestead in the area. Clara wrote back with the relevant information and added a note about the land and the water and the particular quality of the valley in October, which she'd found was the month when it looked most like a place worth staying. 3 months later, the nephew's family arrived. Their eldest daughter became the school's 14th student. Clara made a note in her planning book. Need second teacher by spring. She had, in fact, already identified a candidate, a young woman in Billings who had written to the Territorial Education Office looking for a frontier posting, whose letter had been forwarded to Clara by the same office that had sent the first books. Her name was Agnes Pfeiffer, and she had 2 years of classroom experience and a letter of reference from a school principal in Missouri that described her as thorough and unflappable. Clara wrote to Agnes Pfeiffer in December. Agnes Pfeiffer wrote back in January. By February, they had an arrangement, and in April, Agnes Pfeiffer arrived at Mercer Flat on the same supply wagon that brought the spring seed order, carrying 2 trunks and a very competent expression. She was 24, had a quick mind and a no-nonsense manner, and within a week had identified every student's specific weakness and started doing something about it. Clara watched this and felt the specific satisfaction of having found someone who would do the work better in certain ways than she could. You're going to be good at this, Clara told her, during one of the early evenings when Agnes was reviewing the week's lesson plans at the kitchen table. Agnes looked up. I know, she said, without arrogance, the way you say things that are simply accurate. Clara liked her immediately. The conversation happened on a night in late spring, after the boys were in bed and the house was quiet and the spring darkness outside the window was full of the particular sounds of a valley waking up, frogs in the creek, something moving in the grass, the horses settling in the barn that had now stood long enough to feel permanent. Cole was at the table. Clara was at the table. This was where they seemed to end up, the 2 of them, at the end of things. The kitchen table with the lamp between them, which was not romantic exactly, but was something real and specific to them, a location that meant this is where we are honest. I've been thinking about something, Cole said. She waited. When we married, he said, I told you it was a legal arrangement, that nothing beyond that was assumed. He looked at the table. I want to say plainly that it's not that anymore. For me, I don't know when it changed exactly, and I can't point to the moment, but I want you to know that. Clara looked at him. He was looking at the table with the expression of a man who has assembled something careful and is delivering it as carefully as he assembled it. "Cole," she said. He looked up. "I know," she said. "I've known for a while." He looked at her. "And?" "And I'm here," she said. "I'm still here." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That's not exactly a declaration." "No," she agreed. "It's better than one. A declaration is what you say at the beginning when you don't know yet. This is what you say after you've seen the barn burn twice and argued about arithmetic books and sat in a root cellar with 2 children who needed you to be calm." She paused. "I'm here. That's what I have. It's not small." Cole looked at her for a long time with an expression she had, by now, a name for. She'd had a name for it since November, really, but hadn't said so because some things you hold until the right moment, and this was it. "No," he said. "It's not small." He reached across the table and put his hand over hers, which was neither dramatic nor elegant, and was exactly right. She turned her hand over, and that was all the ceremony there was. But it was enough. More than enough. In the way that the things you build slowly and survive together are always more than enough. Outside, the spring night went on doing what spring nights do, indifferent to the small human warmth inside the house, which is as it should be. The world is not organized around private moments, but private moments happen anyway, and they matter, and the people in them carry them forward. Well, years later, enough years that Noah was studying engineering in Helena and writing long, enthusiastic letters home about hydraulic systems, and Levi was keeping the ranch books with a precision that made even Sutherland comment favorably when he reviewed them. People in Harlan Creek would tell the story of Clara Mercer, the way frontier communities tell stories about people who changed things. They got details wrong. They embellished. They collapsed the timeline and simplified the antagonist and made the resolution cleaner than it was. That's what stories do. They find the shape of a thing and emphasize it until the shape is all that's left. What they remembered was, she came off the train with nothing, and she didn't leave, and she built something. What they didn't say, because it's hard to put into the shape of a story, was the actual texture of it. The weeks of being afraid and not showing it. The nights of writing letters by lamplight when she wasn't certain any of it would matter. The argument about arithmetic books, which was embarrassing in retrospect because she'd been right, but also because being right didn't make you easy to live with. The morning she'd found the boys in their mother's burned house watching a bird protect her eggs, and how she'd sat down uninvited because something told her to. The moments that weren't dramatic, the ones that were just showing up, doing the work, staying in the situation all the way instead of part way. That was the thing she'd learned. The one she would have said, if anyone had asked her directly, was the most true. Not that love conquers things, because love is not in the habit of conquering things on its own. Not that persistence always wins, because it doesn't. But that the decision to be fully present in a life, not the life you planned, not the one that would have been easier, but the actual one in front of you, is the only decision that leads anywhere worth going. She had come west with $11 and a canceled engagement, and the vague hope that something might be different if she moved toward it. What she'd found was not what she'd hoped for. What she'd found was harder and stranger and more specific and more real, and she had stayed inside it all the way, and it had become hers. The school was still running 20 years after she'd started it. Agnes Pfeiffer stayed for 3 years and then married Cass Breck's eldest son and moved to the next valley. But by then the Territorial Education Office had established a formal teacher's post, and the school had a proper building, not a converted bunkhouse, and a bell that you could hear from the North Road on a clear morning. Molly Breck, the girl with the uneven braids in the 3rd row on that first September morning, became a teacher herself, in a schoolhouse 3 valleys east, and she wrote to Clara every few years with news that was mostly practical and occasionally funny, and always had, at the end, some version of the same thing. "I still think about what you showed me. Not the lessons, the other things." Clara wrote back every time. The letters got shorter as she got older, not because she had less to say, but because she'd found that the thing most worth saying tended to be short. The last letter she wrote to Molly ended with this: "The bravest thing I ever did wasn't walking into a burning barn or standing in a saloon telling the truth to men who didn't want to hear it. It was deciding, on a train platform with $11 and no prospects, to keep going. Everything else followed from that. It always does." She folded the letter and put it in an envelope and sealed it, And then she sat for a moment at the kitchen table. The same kitchen table. In the same kitchen, which had grown around her the way places do when you stay in them long enough, acquiring the specific character of the lives lived inside them. Outside, the valley went on in its unhurried way. The creek ran full with spring melt. The barn stood where it had always stood, in the place Cole had built it, solid and permanent looking in the way that things look permanent when they've survived enough attempts to unmake them. The horses moved in the pasture. Somewhere on the property, a dog who was not Scout, but was Scout's granddaughter, was investigating something in the grass near the old burned foundation, where the killed deer still nested every spring, as reliably as anything Clara had ever counted on. She looked out the window at all of it, at the ordinary endurance of things, and thought, yes, this is what it looks like, a life that was built instead of given, not tidy, not finished, not without the scars of everything that tried to end it, but standing, still standing, in the morning light. She put the letter in her coat pocket to mail, and she stood up and she went on.